How you doing there, Michelle?
Yeah, good. How are you doing, Daniel?
I am good. I am good. Well, it is wonderful to have you here today. So, Michelle, we're at the net 200. Why philosophize your life, Michelle? Why do this? What are we doing, Michelle? What are we doing? Beloved, what are we doing?
That's hilarious. That's wonderful. It's a very important question. And honestly, it can sometimes feel a little bit difficult to answer to people who haven't experienced it, who haven't been in it, who may not be as, um, like they may just automatically not know what it is, so they won't do it. So then it's a little bit difficult to explain because I was actually thinking about that. But it's an important thing to ask yourself, like, how would you explain it to somebody else, right? If somebody says, well, why, what exactly are you doing with those talks online? Like it's questions you might encounter from whether it's family members or friends or people in your community. And what are you going to say? you know, um, because it doesn't really seem fitting to just call it like a philosophy club, even though you could kind of try to make it more intelligible to people and say that, okay, what's kind of like a philosophy club, or it's kind of like a philosophy salon or whatever. um, but I mean, you could say that, and I think that's fine to a degree. Because again, you're just trying to give it in terms that people like already understand, like they know what a club is. um, and but obviously it isn't exactly a club, like in that regard. But I think there's something about why what it is being in a space that requires you to listen, suspend your judgment, and engage with what's actually happening, what's actually being discussed. And it makes me think of this art drawing method that was developed by a woman named, oh my gosh, it's going to escape me now, Barbara, something with an M. Um, but she came up with, you can look it up online, pure contour drawing. And it's also been called line contour drawing. There's a gentleman who's also attributed with this, like in a different country, who also came up, like, who's also attributed with that this concept of this method, but this woman developed it more thoroughly, like, and she teaches this still. But actually it's a method I learned when I was learning to draw. But the point of the matter is, it's when you actually look at what you're drawing, you don't do the symbolic, just, oh, okay, I want to draw a cat, so I'm going to start to draw what my symbol is of a cat. You actually look at what you're drawing, and you allow your perception to be what guides your pure contour line, right? You're actually drawing the edges and the details, and you're really focusing on what is actually in front of you. And it makes me think about how that actually can help engage the right brain, and it helps to put perception over perfection. But actually that ends up being the perfecting work, because this is the preliminary way to learn how to draw in advanced ways, is to start with blind contour drawing, where you break out of your preconceived notions of what things are, and you allow yourself to just draw what's in front of you and perceive it. So why I'm bringing that up is because I think these spaces of conversation and philosophy, and why we even do our talks on OG Rose, our regular Friday things, and have the great privilege to talk with others in that same way, is because it's kind of doing a perception, as a perfecting work. It's doing a let's actually listen and hear what we're like. Well, let's really listen to what's being said and take it on its own terms, and then be able to engage with that, to acknowledge it, and then also to push it, or to see what it makes other people think of, and what does it bring up for them. And um, and then being able to actually see if there's some things we can draw out of that that can help people actually live in ways that are different and also more beautiful. That's a goal for me. That's a hope for me. That's how I would like to be able to engage with this, so that it translates into lived lived difference, or lived a lived experience that's informed by the philosophical conversations, that it is more toward the true, beautiful, and good. um, and I also think it can help tremendously with anxiety, or when you feel stuck in a thought. It's like the process of being able to put it out there and actually, let's work with this, because if we don't, it's just this again. It's that kind of like, it's the symbolic. I mean, I don't want to question symbols too much, because symbols also play a role very significantly in our unconscious. But basically, when we just use the projection of this is a cat, right? We don't actually see what is in front of us. And sometimes, like, doing the process of talking through an idea, can really help you to not just let it be this thing that it isn't actually, in a sense. And when it's still back here in your head, you aren't really getting a grasp on how real that is, how much that actually is substantiated, and how much, like, it's basically you're allowing it to control you by not ever working through what is that actual idea, what is that actual fear, or what is that actual hang up, or what is that actual issue. And maybe this philosophical conversation won't resolve it per se. However, it gives you at least a better relationship with your own deep questions that you wrestle with, or issues or things that you come across that you have a hard time understanding or integrating into your life. But yeah, I think the last thing I'll say is that I think these philosophical type of conversations, which really are just open, unjudgmental conversations, really allow you to learn from others, and then also they allow you to learn an articulation and a kind of a more focused a way to see things and have an articulation for them, so that again you can actually do something differently in your life. Like, for example, Daniel and I had a conversation about detail, and how this works in our fiction, and how much it's almost like if you don't get the details right, sometimes if you don't get the details right, this is a cruel reality, but it can basically invalidate the whole story if you don't get the details right. We might not like that, but this is the truth. This is like, you can make a really nice, you could be inviting a friend over and have everything really nice and everything's really good, but if the detail of your tone is not correct, you can basically dismiss everything else, because the person suddenly feels like they don't feel comfortable there because your tone of voice was so aggressive, or made them feel unwelcome, if that makes sense. So like, the details really matter. And we were talking about this as it relates to spaces and cleaning and tidying. And it's just something where you get a better articulation of how, oh my gosh, the ontological structure of doing story well actually relates to making home well or doing spaces well. And so basically, when having this idea of the details matter, it's like, it's helped me to pay attention to details and not overlook them and be like, well, at least I'm doing the majority of this stuff. Well, yeah, but actually, why you still feel kind of squirrely and overwhelmed by the space if the details aren't fixed. So go ahead and do the details. And if you keep on that, like, don't overlook the details, you actually find you're getting the second, like Daniel and I talk about the first things first, second things also. So if you do the second things of the big stuff, but you don't do the details, you kind of don't get any of it. You're just everything's kind of messy. But if you do the details first and then the larger, kind of more obvious stuff, then you find yourself doing both much more easily. How did this happen? Like, I've known this for a long time, but why did our conversation in the kitchen about details, or on the porch, wherever we were, Daniel, why did that make me live differently? It did, though. It really did, because of our articulation. So anyway, this is why I think it matters to do philosophy, to have these types of conversations, to do the net. And I appreciate you all for being able to be open and willing to participate in such spaces, because again, they afford such generative things in my life. And yeah, that's all I will say for now. But thanks, Daniel, for asking me the question.
Magnificent. No, and Mr. Satori, good to see you. We're talking a little bit for why do this? Because we're on 200, so I guess 4 or 5 years or whatever, which is extraordinary how time goes. And so why do this? And we're also talking a little bit about this mysterious way in which a reframing, a new articulation suddenly makes something that you've been looking at for a very long time finally something you can see. How an articulation can unlock energy that you didn't, out of nowhere. We were also talking the other day about how there typically is this idea of energy being this, you take a nap, you go to bed, then you wake up and you have energy again, like a slope kind of thing. But really, suddenly you'll have a conversation and energy comes out of nowhere. You'll get inspired. So there's this other kind of energy that seems to be lurking mysteriously. And correct articulations, correct ideas can kind of unlock things. And yeah, it's very interesting as well with philosophy in these kind of spaces. There's always this problem in modeling where if I have a model or map, Mr. Satori, I look forward to that new Substack you put out. That looks fantastic. Satori's been doing fantastic work on AI with the social coordination mechanism, so I think it's really important. If a map is too perfect, then it's useless, because it's like, if it's like got every detail, right? Like, it's the box idea that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Likewise, all abstractions are wrong, but some are useful. So if you get a map that's too perfect, then it doesn't work. And it's the same as the territory. A map is useful because it's wrong, right? But of course, if it's too wrong, then it's useless as well. So it has to be wrong in the right way. And what I think is very important about these spaces, and I actually think ultimately for me, this is kind of in some respects the real use of the internet to be, or to say kind of like what the internet is really supposed to be. And we talk all the time about how the fullness of the internet is found in the social coordination mechanism, and that's kind of what we're sublating into. Um, you need a constant, like nobody knows the best mean between right and wrong. Nobody knows an articulation that is best for unlocking, because I guess that's what you see. When you hear the right articulation, or you hear that sermon, or you read that book, or you get that idea, then something can be unlocked, if you will, right? But weirdly enough, you might hear that same idea in different wording 1,000 times before, right? And yet, for some reason, Christian, wonderful to see you, sir. We're kind of talking about why we do these things, and boy, I had a good time at Limicom. Great to see you, sir. So, but you'll hear the same idea many, many times, but then there's one articulation and it erupts, right? And it's really weird, right? So there's this idea with the market that you need a constant testing to determine like what product is good or what is valuable, because no one actually knows, right? So you're constantly testing, and you have a market, and you think that this hose head is the best hose head, and you put it on, but nobody buys it, and you keep testing because nobody knows, right? So you just have to keep testing and testing and testing. And for one person, this hose head or this car or this chair is best, and for another person, it's this chair. And the entire pricing mechanism and distribution of resources is constantly trying to test to determine what is valuable and what is not, because nobody knows. Nobody knows until they encounter it, and then they may get it wrong and have to redo it, and all of these different things, right? So you need this constant testing. I would argue that we've actually always needed the same thing with language and ideas. We've actually always needed a constant testing of ideas, a constant testing of articulation, because no one knows what are the best ideas or the best articulation ahead of time. It has to emerge, right? But that means there has to be people in these spaces who are constantly testing new ways of seeing things, new ways of getting at it. And then suddenly that unlocks for Michelle, or that unlocks for Daniel, right? But not for Bob, but not for Joe, right? So you do you try a new metaphor, right? You try a new metaphor. But when you get the right language, it's almost like a spell. And I know you talked with Molly about spelling, spell, word, spell. That suddenly, boom, there's energy. Boom, there's understanding. And the funny thing is, once that happens, you can't unsee it. Like once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? So there's a kind of loss of freedom, but also there's a gaining of autonomy, because now you are no longer imprisoned by fuzzy ideas or structures that were containing you. Now you have an articulation. And so the social coordination mechanism, I think this work, and I'll throw it to Sartori here, there's a constant testing of articulations. And here's the funny thing. If you ever stop the speaking, well, how do you know you have the best articulations? Likewise, if you stop the market, are you so sure you have the best possible car, the best possible chair, the best possible whatever, right? How do you know, right? So likewise, how do you know that you have the right articulation, the right to Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir. We are talking about why we do this for episode 200. So why this? Why this? So thank you for being here and everything you've done over the years, sir. So likewise, as you need a market to test products, because you don't know what is the best product, and what is today may not be tomorrow, and you need that constant testing. So in history, we've needed a technology in a way to perpetually be testing articulations in speech, because there are better articulations in better accounts than not. Mr. Jockin has spoken of accounts, and we don't know what those accounts are, other than to constantly test and constantly re-speak and constantly try and constantly to encounter, right? And if we don't find those correct articulations, like you were saying, Michelle, then the day doesn't come when you suddenly go, oh, and the energy is unlocked, and you're taking care of the details, right? But one day the articulation hits it, and it's like magic, right? And then on those occasions, it suddenly becomes obvious why these conversations are important. Like on those magic moments where there's an articulation or there's a speech, and bam, then it's unlocked. Bam, you see things anew. Then it is so clear why this kind of work is important. And yet, weirdly, nothing changes at the same time, right? Like nothing changes, and yet everything changes, which suggests that lack is not nothing. But let me pause and give it to Mr. Sartori, and then back to you, Michelle. Mr. Sartori, thank you for being here, sir.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So yeah, this yeah, this is the thing that I was touching on in the piece that I wrote. And, really it was, I used my own personal story, like as the example or whatever. And being able to reflect back on 40 years of experience. And most of that, it wasn't, it's interesting because I was very afraid to articulate. So I just was the observer. But then being in a lot of places, and basically it's like I grew up with a certain amount of pluralism, and like we were born again. My grandparents were Catholic, but it wasn't a contentious thing. Seeing how there was an understanding. It's not always the case. That was the case in my family, which was good to know, because then what I would hear people speak about, like, oh, Catholics, like they're not the I would be like, well, I don't, that would give me another point to reference, and then I would have to wrestle with that, and then realize, oh, well, there, that person's experience was very different from mine, and then that basically just kept expanding into more and more circles, and then, what I was kind of trying to put it in like a vertical stack, because the point is like I can, even like I may have, there may be some articulations that I prefer. And then like I get on the open internet and be like, now I am able to find the people that use my shared articulation that I prefer. But then I find out that they actually mean very different things when they use the same articulation. And it's really kind of like, it is like a vertical hierarchy kind of thing of, at the bottom, it's just like a tribal thing. And then, it's just getting a little bit more a perspective, stepping outside of that particular thing, and seeing the plurality. And at some point you get to the place where you find that the people that are most embodying the thing that you want have actually taken the opposite. It's like you find that the people that have left a church background for all of the best reasons, because that articulation had become very corrupt and had failed. And so then it's like, well, what do you do with that? It's like we have, we mean the same things in like opposite language. And so, and I guess, my point is like, well, on the one hand, it's a little bit depressing, because I'm like, because this is, you've spoken of this too, the further you go with philosophy or whatever, the less able you are to, there's just fewer people the further you go along the journey. So you could find somebody who's close to you, but maybe there's something that they can't quite understand. So however, there's always going to be less. So that's the sad part. But at least maybe if you create some sort of a mechanism where you can kind of find out where people are, then at least, well, this is the level at which I can relate to this person, and maybe I can push them a little bit, but I'm not going to push them all the way to where I'm currently thinking.
Beautifully articulated, and I'll give it to Michelle, Mr. Jockin, and Daniel. Thank you for being here. So we're talking a bit on why do this for episode 200. So why? The great why. I really like what you were saying about the points of reference. I think this is a super big deal, because you will overhear people saying, oh, well, all liberals are idiots. Well, all conservatives are idiots. Well, Catholics not true Christianity, or all of these different things that people say. And if you don't have points of reference in your life by which they make you go, I don't know about that, then you tend to get swept up in it, right? And this has been a huge problem in history, right? Because what were the chances that you were around, well, every possible person, which of course is not possible even now, but you tended to be around people similar. That's just how things go with nations and geography and so on and so forth. So your points of reference were such that they were contained, and you probably didn't have points of references to stop yourself from going head over heels in for a notion that people voiced about this people being stupid or these people being brainwashed or whatever. But when you have points of reference in family or online or in these sort of spaces, that goes a long way to creating self-defense just naturally. Like, not necessarily because you like train in a dojo, just having those conversations create a subconscious or conscious hesitation to give yourself over entirely and to whatever people are saying around you. And I think without that pause, I think so much of freedom is found in the ability to pause. And if you can't just pause before accepting, you're swept along. And so much of life is to live in such a way that you don't just get swept along. And the problem is, I don't think the work of making sure you're not susceptible to getting swept along can ever end. In the same way that the market has to keep testing products, I think the work like this has to continue. So the importance of doing these spaces and these conversations is lifelong, because it is ever testing, ever checking yourself, ever adding new points of reference. I'm always amazed how stupid I was just recently, and how stupid I was just recently upon that. Like, as you do this work and learn more and more, you're like, I can't believe I was that dumb. Like, I think often, like after like coming out of like college, when you supposedly are college educated, I knew effing nothing. And yet you're supposedly the top, you're college educated. No, like if you don't know anything. Like if you don't do lifelong learning, you don't know anything. And if you do lifelong learning, you kind of know something. But anything short of lifelong learning, you're an idiot. And I'm always amazed at how much of an idiot I was, actually. And then you have a conversation, go, actually, your understanding of Hegel's wrong. That understanding of economics is missing something. That understanding of love is wrong. That understanding of Christianity is missing. It's like, but wait, I read all those books 20 years ago. I thought no, you would nowhere. And so that means this kind of work needs to continue forever and ever, which one can sound depressing. But then when you realize that it helps you find new articulations that unlock things that otherwise wouldn't be unlocked. It helps you find the others who are out there that are hard to find, but then you find them and you have that quality of relation you otherwise can't get. I think it creates a lot of hope. And I'm also thinking more and more about how articulation itself is the structure of membranics versus hard lines. I'll have to say more on that. But I think that work of finding the articulation, finding out that people mean something entirely different, all of this is what I want to say. It's a real work. Like, it's a real meaningful work to do that, working through articulation, working through ideas. And I think so much of our world today in global pluralism hinges upon people doing that work. Because it's one thing we say empathize and humanize one another. That's very important. But this is the work that we're describing here, which is really understanding how interpersonal dynamics work and why it is when we try to be with one another, we constantly misunderstand one another. Why it is when we try to come together and form new communities, we just eat ourselves alive. Why does that occur? Because no one ever intends for those things to occur. No one intends to get married and get a divorce. And yet it happens all the time. Why? I think we're partly a part of this work is the collective research program of determining the dynamics that make life thus for so many. But I will pause and throw it to Michelle, Mr. Jockin, and Christian. Michelle, please.
Yeah, that's all great, and thank you for what you shared, Sartori. And I was thinking about the word articulation as like articulating a joint, right? Like that is not term used for articulation, right? So it's like I think that's a beautiful connection because it's the wordplay there is that you can suddenly move now, like. Saying this articulation for me that comes to philosophical conversation means I actually have, I live in a different way. So I've had movement. I've been able to shift, and that's what articulation is. That's what articulation is, and that's why it's so important. I think though there's a lot of fear around allowing for new articulations to come forth. That comes from, well, first of all, it's kind of like, well, if there's all these articulations. How are we ever going to know what's the right way or whatever? There's that like the fears of like how we're often indoctrinated with how to learn the right answer or whatever. And then there's also from, sometimes religious perspectives where it's like, well, we can't be adding to the Bible. We can't be adding to this. We can't be adding to scripture. And it's a valid concern. But it's almost as if we don't trust the Holy Spirit working out through our lives, if from the Christian paradigm, where it's like, this is actually to have a particularization of what does it mean for you? It's a testimony, and not just in a strict salvation sense, but what does it mean to actually understand this for yourself? How to understand this for your own life, and that's huge. And I think there's a lot of fear around it because, again, for the reasons I just stated. But I think, nevertheless, it's important to take a deep breath, trust that you can do that work of articulation, and that's actually a good work to do. It's not just merely rebellion or something like that. It's actually allowing for the articulation of the appendages in your life and your mind and your body and your spirit, so that you can actually move through things and seasons in your life and issues in your life, so you can move through them. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
No, I think that's very well put. I think basically it is very hard to be free if you cannot articulate, because you're just going to be swept up in whatever you overhear or what people say. The capacity for articulation of which these spaces was working through. And you see, I think there's something else where the very act of learning of the speaking and having accounts that are bashing up against one another and you have to think through. I think many conflicts start in the speaking act. They start in hearing something you don't like and you knee jerk, or you don't know how to respond in a manner that is able to humanize the person you disagree with, or you really don't like what they said, but simultaneously voice a question that suggests disagreement, but simultaneous openness to what they just said, because maybe you're just assuming what they mean by that, and to have a certain sort of gymnastics work. You are not taught that. If you do not learn that, it's going to show up in your marriage. It's going to show up in your friendship. It's going to show up at work. And then the problem is these moments, if they go awry, they can tear down a lot. They can destroy everything even. They can really lead to deep hurt. And so also this train. So here's, I guess, the double move. And Sam, it's so wonderful to have you here. The double move I'm thinking about is basically articulations really matter, especially at key moments that are eventually going to show up. It's just probable they're going to show up. But you also have the problem of it is not self-evident what articulation is best for that moment. Like we were saying, there's this market mechanism. You always, like, the articulation you think is best may not be. And if you don't have spaces to continually test and try this, and no one in the group understands, well, let me think about it again, and let me reread, and you're always looking for a new articulation to unlock. And always testing, always testing. If you don't engage in that regular testing, you're going to have some articulation, some way of speaking that you're going to bring to those moments. And the probability of it being correct, in the same way that if the market only gave you one chair, the probability of that being the best of all possible chairs for all possible circumstances is remarkably low. Likewise, if you only have one articulation and are not trained in articulation flexibility, the likelihood that you will address or respond adequately to that key moment when it occurs, and there will be a few of them, is low. And then it's kind of like we say philosophy has something to do with a fire hydrant, like a fire extinguisher. You don't need a fire extinguisher often. Like, that's why people are like, what's the point of philosophy? Well, you don't need a fire extinguisher often, but when you need it, if you do not have it, the consequences are dire. Likewise, the capacity of articulation, the ability to handle difference, the ability to hear something you don't like and yet respond in a manner, nevertheless, that makes the person feel heard, understood, and yet also speak back in a manner that is not passive. These are key capacities that at key moments are very important. But again, it is not self-evident what the right articulation is. Thus, you need regular testing, a mechanism of that testing and organization. But let me throw it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
Obviously, I want to first say 200 episodes of the net. It's kind of crazy to think about that. Obviously, it's a great joy to know you, Daniel and Michelle, and everyone else here in the net. I've gotten a lot of insight from being part of the net. So I think it's been 5 years. I don't know how long it's taken us to get 200 episodes, but it's kind of crazy the accumulation of time that's occurred. Anyways, so I just want to give that note. I think when I'm thinking, I had in my note before, right, Daniel talked about key moments. So I think kairos, the particular moment, opportune moment. I was going to add my notes, the interplay of that to key words, which is interesting because key words are the kind of indexical, query indexes that freeze up, right? If I just use the right keyword, I can get the understanding, right? But as we're talking through that, I think Satori is making a great point about it, or this use of these keywords don't necessarily map onto the same reality. Because this is a demonstration of why names are images. Because the images may not be connected to the actual reality that they're trying to portray or present. With all the airs of intelligibility and reason and logic built into it. So thus, logos is not necessarily just words or names just kind of plopped down. It's the interplay, right? The interplay, emotion, and movement of those names. That's what generates reality or truth. I think that's really interesting in my mind. I think especially, I attended a AI discussion of the faculty here where I'm teaching, and I think in general that the idea of this kind of I posited to the group this idea of relationship and this the need of friendship in knowledge, right? completely did not land at all. And in fact, we have members in the group going, "Oh no, I mean, I'm this professor, but I need to make a little program for my son. I asked AI to do it." Like, and I'm pointing out, you have computer science majors, like computer science professors in the school, but do you realize what's going on with the AI? It's the drive of the acceleration of the AI. So why do I need to relate to others when there's an absolute knower of a statistical object that I can get that will tell me what to know, right? Or do what I needed to do. So I don't need to relate to others. So actually, I think in terms of like the answer to the question is why the net? I think, quite frankly, the contrast is massive in terms of why, because we need to cultivate discourse with one another under a friendship of knowledge or virtue. I think it relates to a kind of courage. And I think especially when we're under spaces like this, where, there might be disagreements and we have to mediate those disagreements in a way that doesn't blow up the relationship. I think absolutely, Orthos Logos is not just having a static account and having an inflexibility to respond to change, because that's not reality. Orthos Logos is that abiding willingness to be in relationship, right? That the account is the address. To use your English, Daniel, it's an address, right? Orthos Logos is an address. Shout outs to Dall-E again. And I think that motion and movement. Actually, on one of the panels I attended today by a student was on interior versus exterior freedom. And in general, the whole operation has been this emphasis of external freedom and choice. Like choice is the decider of interior freedom. I'm almost frustrated that the necessity of virtue for that freedom was not emphasized more, right? Because I think Daniel know about that pause to not get caught up, that pause of the smoothness of the accounts of keywords so that in the key moments you can confront difference, see different perspective. And this is the traditional mode of charity, right? In the academic context, charity is to say, this is a legitimate thinker who's tarrying with thought, and I need to take this seriously what they're saying. I may disagree with it. I may come to a completely different conclusion, but I have to take seriously what's being presented to me. This is a very different relation. Like, AI, you notice you're either going to take a carte blanche, like you're just going to take it as the knower, right? Or you're just going to ignore it. Like, I don't see us having a tearing with AI, right? In that same way. So I think ultimately, it's the articulation of friendship. Again, I think it's totally kind of over the head of entire disciplines of thought and academics that I find the net is very much interested in. I think there is the danger of conversional agreement, right? There's always that tension and danger about it. But nevertheless, I find something like the net very powerful for cultivating thought, I think, in the way of the addresser that you've been talking about, Dan, for a long time.
Very well put. Thank you, Mr. Jockin. I'll give it to Christian here. And, as you were speaking there, first off, Satori has been doing fantastic work on thinking AI with the social coordination to make people come to the girdle point, or to find points of unnecessary, where people are using a term and they think they're doing it differently, but actually, they think it's the same, but it's different. And you know how so many conversations get lost in, basically debates about words, and how that actually just goes in the direction of internally consistent systems and indestructibility and so on and so forth. Like, actually, could AI be used in a way to bring people to encountering one another in the girdle point, to actually help the average person, say, create spaces like this, more so than running from one another? And I think it's a very interesting question. But I would certainly say that, unfortunately, there can be a tendency to use AI in a manner that just feeds map sealing and map insulation. And then that idea of, I don't need friendship to think, I just have AI. That, of course, is a very dangerous move that I think becomes a temptation, because people are hard. So why would I deal with them? I'll just go to AI. And why deal with all that psychoanalytical stuff people are talking about? And why risk someone making me feel as if I need to change my life, like some Rilke poem? That's hard. So, that's a real danger. And I think basically the question of if we will use our technology to extend our humanity versus replace it, the convivial versus manipulation of Ivan Illich, is the question of our moment. And basically, I think it will require ultimately regaining the category of friendship, because friendship is a fundamentally metaphysical and philosophical relationship. And if we don't know what it is, or we don't have a strong sense of what it is, then I think it will be very difficult not to fall into an understanding of relationships in a pure utility that is actually making one another fungible in a manner that then actually just contributes to the loss of that category. I guess the other thing I was thinking about is the word articulation. There can be a problem with that because it can sound like there's a magic word that if you just say that word in the conversation, then everything would kind of work out, right? So there is a problem, but there is something to be said about, I'm almost now thinking about articulate, and obviously the word I use is address. So you could say at key moments, if you're not able to address them, which is not merely a matter of speaking, but also body, presence, energy, patience, action, addressing is not merely linguistic. However, there is something central about communication. There is something central about words. I don't want to say it's the only thing, but words really are very powerful and they really matter. And they seem to have an ability to affect subjectivity in human beings uniquely. Like if I punch you in the face, it's not the same as if I say I hate you, right? But isn't that odd? So there's something about words that can create connections that are not there physically. So I think an emphasis on words is warranted. And of course, I did sign language, so it doesn't have to be, from the mouth. But there is something important about that. But it is interesting. But nevertheless, address is very. But articulation, it's funny. Articulation with a hyphen at art. So there's something about being a work of art with other people. Can you make every interaction artful? Like having a certain skillfulness and artfulness, and I know Christian has emphasized skill, and we talk about courage all the time, and the importance of that. But if you do not have the ability to make key moments artful, or to articulate, to bring art into the moment, this can be very, very consequential. Now, of course, how you make something art, if it's I like that term, of course, because if it's overly systemized and top down, it's mechanic and dies. There's something organic and alive about art. So there's a skillfulness that is needed. You're going to have to listen. You're going to have to pay attention. Just like if you're writing a novel, you have to note if what your characters are doing is believable, et cetera, so forth. So there's a real full awareness, full attention, to use that Simone Weil term, that is required in order to engage in articulation, to do that fun little wordplay on this day. But it seems very important. And again, there's the $1 million problem is in the same way that you can't know what you can't know. Like you don't know what you don't know. True ignorance. There's knowing what you don't know, which is ignorance, and there's true ignorance, which is not knowing what you don't know. And furthermore, nobody thinks they're going to get married to get a divorce. Nobody thinks that they're going to do all. So we're already in this mechanism of self-deception and not knowing what we don't know. So likewise, nobody thinks, or it's almost like impossible to think that you will not be able to properly address or properly articulate at key moments what is necessary, right? It's just, how do you think that, right? The very fact there is something about, for me at least, the continual work of joining spaces like this, which of course is tied to friendship with all of you extraordinary people. There's also the doing of the work, because I don't think there is any. I do not I do not believe in myself to be at such a point of my development of which I could stop this work, because I'll be able to address all possible moments that arise and surprise me whenever they come up. Like I said, 10 years ago, when you think you know it, you're an idiot. I still think I'm an idiot and don't know I'm an idiot. So you have to continually do that work, right? And you always want to, in the same way that I don't think there's any day you finally go to the gym and do that final set with the bar, and you're done, or that final lap on the track and you're done. So I think it goes with the work of articulation. But I think it's also a wonderful work, hence why I think it is a characteristic of eternity and beauty. But I will pause and I will throw it to Christian here. Christian, thank you for coming on this fine day, sir.
Happy to be here and to see everyone. Nice to meet you, Mr. Sartori. I wanted to, first of all, plug for probably the 10th time that book Trickster Makes This World, where the wordplay or the kind of sing the resonance and etymology of articulation linked to what Michelle was talking about in terms of flexibility and joint work. And then specifically that word art from articulation, that's a big theme throughout the book explicitly. How do the artists break things, such as to create new joints, such as to make the system more flexible in ways that it needs to be more flexible as it evolves and in response to its environment and itself? This is often the work of artists. the question of, why this, or what is this, I think is easier for me. Like, what is it that we're doing here? Yes, because I won't dare ask the why question at this point. I've given up on whys, but I could say what are we doing? And I think so I do agree in general, like spaces of conversation like this, we need more of them. That's why I'm working on the Weems project. It's just, yeah, it's vital. There's something I'm seeing that makes this a bit like prayer, which is something I'm exploring a lot lately. I'm visiting my family. I've gotten my dad to pray with me for 20 minutes every morning. And I'm a meditator, and I've done some like what I would call prayer, but not so much in the Christian context. And so I've just been, going back to the Bible. What does the Bible say about prayer, etc.? What am I doing how do I explain meditation and contemplation to my dad? What is this funny game? But I think it's similar to some of the points that were being articulated and addressed to the group here, which are that there's this need for constant renewal, right? To not let the waters stagnate. And I think prayer, let's say I use a meta category like meditation as broadly as I use the term exercise. And then within that, let's say that prayer is like a subcategory that can also take many forms. Like, I don't think there's like one type of prayer, but at least one form of prayer, which like leans into, I guess, more Zen, perhaps, than Buddhist type of sensibility, is this kind of continuously coming back to zero. Just like, it's that, I think you were talking about to some extent, Daniel, when you're talking about that pause, right? It's like, wait, can I just push pause for a second and take whatever I've been thinking about, all the momentum of my thoughts, all the stickiness, for me, it's a lot of time, it's, can I let go of the satisfaction of getting to the end of this chain of thinking or reasoning or strategizing or articulating, honestly, sometimes. Because I find the articulation so satisfying. It's, I think maybe a lot of us do. That's why we're talky people. But can I pause that? Can I not be so overtaken by my appetite for that satisfaction of articulation that I can pause my articulation, come back to zero, and just ask the question, what am I doing? What am I trying to articulate again? Why? Why is this important? Why is this a good use of the next 20 minutes of my time? What rabbit am I chasing? I find that for me, a certain kind of prayer meditation is very helpful for like gaining that pause muscle. Although I'm going to relate it to faith, and why? Because there's underneath, at least when it's a compulsive satisfaction, right? When we compulsively seek ourselves to be satisfied, that's, I think, almost always, if not always, responding to an anxiety, right? It's I can't be still. I can't stop. I can't let go because right, and so I think the dimension that's been brought to my prayer life or meditation life with prayer is seeing how a relation to God or the transcendent or unconditional love or whatever your baseline transcendental good beauty, whatever is, that's like your toes touching the bottom of the sand when you're out in the ocean for a second. Like, oh, okay, I'm like, I can, or in a sense, it's like letting go and floating on top of the water is maybe a better metaphor there, where it's like, I'm tired and I'm swimming and I'm not sure which way to go. I need to rest. Can I relax so much that it becomes effortless to feel okay? Effortless to feel okay. Okay. Now I've caught my breath. Now I can get my bearings. Now I can, I've got that pause. great. You know, I've reassessed, and even pausing once. I was thinking about this the other day. Even just pausing once means you get to do something twice. You get to center your intuitions twice, which is 200% more than you otherwise would, right? It's like it's a huge increase to just pause once, rather than not at all. So I think this is really important. Spaces like the net specifically, I think it's, you know, the or fire extinguisher analogy, I think it's apt. And I think not everyone is a firefighter, right? Or a steward of the woods and looking out for the dangers. But there's got to be some that are like, you know, keeping the blade sharp and making sure that, you know, everything's in place and things haven't rusted out. And right, yeah. And so I do cherish the net for that reason. So thank you. Congratulations on 200. Last tidbit is, I won't go on about this, but logos as an interplay that creates reality or truth, from Jockin. I've been leaning more deeply into this idea I brought up previously about relating logos to one-dimensional spaces, which is basically, like as I was saying at some earlier, net boundaries or intersections, right? These kind of non-spacious distinguishments between this and that. Yeah, it's I've only been diving more deeper into that rabbit hole, and I think more finding it blossoming in more and more ways. So anyways, I just wanted to say that for whatever it might mean to Jockin, this phrasing of logos as an interplay that creates reality or truth. Yes, like interplay or intersection, or that the meeting point of that which is the truth itself. That which defines is the boundary. And I heard you say something at some point, Daniel, that I was going to hope that you speak more about, which was something about membranes. And I forget if you were relating that to articulation or something, but I was like, oh, I want to hear Daniel say more about what he's thinking about with I think he used the term like membranic or membrane, something like this, but yeah.
No, fantastic. And thank you for being here and your kind words as well. And yes, that there's something about today, what is needed. You always have the inclusion and exclusion problem. If you're overly inclusive, your system falls apart, but it's overly exclusive, then it can become tribal and all that sort of issues. And the thing that that I've been thinking a lot about is that language in its very nature of becoming something you like refined. Like philosophers get a really refined language, and you have to do it to get what they're saying, or theologies, or anyone, right? That actually this very tendency of language through time to become refined can have a membranic structure. There's a boundary, but it's not too hard that no one can enter, but it also is meaningful. Now, I have a lot more to say on that, and I think this system is actually part of creating and spreading membranics according to boundaries of language, which actually helps us deal with the inclusion-exclusion problem. But I'll say more on that. I'll give it to Daniel here in a moment. I love everything you were saying about polls, prayers. That was all fantastic. And yeah, you know, it's interesting because you were also talking about this need to speak and need to articulate. And I often think about that. And I guess just reflecting on my own personal life, like, how do you make sure you don't end up in a place when you're speaking when you don't need to, or you're writing another book that isn't needed, or you're just going on and on, right? One of the reasons I guess I'm just kind of personally almost hesitant, and I'm not saying it's bad, but like you'll see people who've become professors or professional academics where then speaking and articulating depends on their paycheck, right? Like they have to speak and they have to publish and they have to write because they kind of, well, that's how they get paid, right? Or if they come to be known as someone who speaks, like you get into all of those different dynamics. To me, it's so, and also too, it's really important for me at the net that we don't know what we're going to talk about, which increases the probability that what we speak about is something that people have encountered in their lived experience. So they're speaking from coming upon something that seems like it matters, but they don't know exactly what to do or how to articulate it, and that's what they bring forth. So the speaking comes from lived experience versus speaking in order to make a paycheck, or speaking because that's your expertise, or all of those different things, right? So to me, it's really important to have a dynamic where you don't know what you're going to talk about, because that increases the probability that what is talked about is not speaking for speaking's sake, but a genuine sort of, this is something I've come across, what do you people think? Or it comes from a real wrestling, right? Because I think when speaking does not knows its topic ahead of time, there can be a tendency to be self-relating, where ideas are self-relating with ideas, right? And so it's very interesting, because you always have to, I think, design spaces in such a manner to decrease the probability that you're going to be speaking for speaking's sake, or things like that. And how do you do that from a design standpoint, right? Because there's also something to be said where you need regularity in order to create consistency relationship, in order to coordinate effectively. For people that's knowing going on, it's knowing death. But if you have regularity, then you run the risk of just speaking when you don't need to, right? In order just to fill the air. Well, if you don't know what you're going to talk about, and also you have people that bring different accounts and put them together, and you can't predict all the ways those accounts go together, then the speaking comes from surprise and encounter, which I think lowers the probability of it entering into self-relation in a problematic sense, and therefore equilibrium. I think, honestly, one of the reasons why people can get trouble in relationships and marriage is because they find, when they're dating, they perhaps are talking about things that are based on ideas or things, but when you get married, you then are speaking from things you encounter logistically, or surprises, or different things. And if you're not used, there is a difference between speaking live about something you've encountered that you don't know the answer to, and speaking when you kind of know what you're going to say, or you're just kind of sharing information and experience, right? Like trivia questions, right? The ability to speak in more of the encounter surprise way that we're describing, I think, is really, really beneficial to marriages and relationships, because that's, I think, the kind of speech event that leads to a whole lot of arguments and problems that people don't know to talk through. And so you also, I think, want to create spaces where the kind of speech act that people are doing is also going to translate to helping them in their marriages, and their relationships, and their job, and their interpersonal things, because there are different kinds of speech acts. And I think most people, unfortunately, the only speech act they've ever been trained in is one in where they're sharing something they already know, and that sets them up for trouble when they come upon something where they have to talk about a surprise or something going wrong, and they're not used to speaking about that. And that's the place where I think speaking is best emerged from. Otherwise, there's absolutely something to be said about the importance of that prayer, of that pause. But more can be said, but I'll pause and give it to Daniel. Daniel, thank you for being here today, sir.
Lovely to be here, always. Yeah, 200. Speaking for speaking's sake, I'm just speaking because I'm filling space and air. I'm gonna say a bunch of nonsense like, thank you, it's nice to see all of you. But it really is. It's like so strange. It's I guess on the theme of prayer. That there's something about just like the background condition, or trying to bring attention to something that's just obvious. It's like a real art of thanksgiving or gratitude. That's not always. Yeah, maybe I'll say some other stuff before coming around that way. Because I mean, I can think offhand, like 3 situations come to mind, Daniel, where I've either been with you in a Zoom room or seen a recording of you, and someone has presented something difficult, almost like a subtly accusatory toward you, like that you're not embodying the thing that you're saying, or something like this. Usually that kind of structure, because you can always accuse of not embodying enough, especially when you're in a Zoom room on the other side of the world. But I'm always taken by your response, by the way that you respond. I love it. Like it's a that's like it's so special, those having recordings of those interactions, and this medium condition is super new. like it's really new. Like this is not it's wild that so who knows? Like a part of the why, I guess there's also a temptation in that newness and the novelty to just kind of get off on that a bit, on just the strangeness, or which is it's funny because I've been thinking about um, um, I get the structure. So there's the minimal constraint in the net of we don't know what we're going to speak about. That provides a certain affordance, and then the very like act of conversation, the act of dialogue is um, it's so human and a meta practice. Like so for me, the net, and I'll just keep it to OG Rose. Other conversations like of most of the channels that I'm involved in, of the ones that I could just share offhand onto my immediate networks with OG Rose is probably the closest there, and the sense of my like most reliable. Like even if I haven't had the time to watch through a conversation, I can kind of trust that I can share it or I can pass it on, and that's actually quite something. There's something about the I guess the embodiment at OG Rose that um it has this translatableness. So it could really like it could land up in the hands of um uh say like an uncle who doesn't want anything to do with the philosophy or whatever, or maybe like it pisses him off or so I piss him off with my languaging and something like that. But so I was speaking about like the structure because it's conversation, because there can also be a danger of uh I don't know, maxing out at conversation. But then I get into this curiosity where I try and imagine constraints of process, and then it's almost like a liturgical design, something like that. Like what is a process constraint like? What would be constraint? How would you set it up? What would be like the repeatable thing? And then it's this like this minimal distance of thinking about context, and then there's this gravity toward good conversations. It's a like the measure is a good conversation, but then I still feel that wanting to not totalize, still wondering about how much the constraints or conditions could be played with, or if there's something like a finding a certain safety in talking, but then I don't want to degrade talking. So I find it curious how I oscillate in that way, like thinking because conversation exercises this natural measure on what I'm aiming for, what any design of something would be aiming for, and it's almost ideal if the design of the thing slips into the background. But then there is also this requirement of sometimes lifting the implicit stuff, and that can be productive. It's kind of how I think about when people speak about magic. I'm kind of ambiguous about expressing this. It's like it can sound very strange sometimes, but it's almost like it's drawing attention to something that's already operative. So we all here together, and then you could maybe even call that like we have a shared field. Now I'm speaking about the field, and because I've named something that we're sharing and operating in, you're just lifting it to reflect on and play with almost. And so it gives a way to play with the thing, but then it's also kind of strange. So you can get, I guess, you can fall for that ontology, or like get or mythologize it, or So there's a delicate space here of skill in that, not depriving ourselves of that kind of technology, but then not falling for the. Anyway, I'm just remembering now that this was I mean, the processes of conversations, the being in some sense in a conversation that has a rhythm, which that's also a space of gratitude that there is this consistency, like it's something to come to. This going conversation, it's been an incredible resource to my own thinking and living life, like how I'll take something, I'll get something, and I can apply it in my immediate relationships and the conversations that I have in the week coming forward, and then I can come back to the nets, and it's like this recalibrating, getting stuff in, feeding back some information of like, oh, this was crazy, and then even the act of articulation it's good to share it, getting feedback, and then I just wish more in my immediate network would watch it, because now I'm having fights with people and like, oh, can you just go listen to Daniel? But let me pass back.
Well, that was all wonderful, and thank you for your very kind words, Sarah. And I'll throw it to Michelle here in a moment. I appreciate all that very, very much. And there's a number of things. There's something about like what you're saying about that. So first, what you're saying about the field, there's something where you can't let talking about the field or philosophy of the field get in the way of making the field or the work of the field. Right? There's something where, in the same way that there's always the risk of talking about Jesus, actually, unfortunately, we then think we're being like Jesus because we talk about Jesus. So likewise, the talk about creating fields or the importance of relationships or the importance of community can go a long way to, unfortunately, people assuming that they've met the conditions by which to afford the possibility of relationships and community and all of those different things. So there's always this, I think the weird thing you're talking about, where there's something about conversation that seems really important, but then there also seems to be a danger in overstating it. There's something weird about talking about something can kill it. Like if you talk about the novel you're writing, you suddenly will never write it. If you talk about how great a community this is, then it can fall apart. There's something about words that create risk. And it seems as if it's like they're not inherently good, but they're also not inherently bad. It's like risk. Risk can be a great thing because it creates value, or it can be a terrible thing. Speaking is a risky act. And I think we're increasingly in an age where risk has to be taken because we don't have givens. And there's something about the shared risk taking that actually can be a basis of community. Like it's risky to go into the girdle point, but that very risk can be by which we form the basis of new social interactions and new forms of subjectivity that handle social global pluralism. So there's something very risky about speech. And there's something also about speaking that can make us think we're doing the thing when we're not. But the very speech itself now is the thing that we have to have courage to face. Like it's like speech itself is a kind of realm that requires courage to go into, precisely because it can go wrong, right? Precisely because there are risks there. I think the other thing that's always just very interesting is when you look around at society and see how much of society is like about people getting together to have conversations. All the benches in the park, all the restaurants, all the walkways. Like if you look around, it's actually extraordinary how much of society is about getting people together to talk, right? Like that's a major infrastructural reality. And yet we don't teach it. We don't train it. We just assume people can do it. And perhaps when they shared givens or whatever they would, but there's all this, one of the reasons people don't have lions, the Robert Putnam bowling alone, why aren't people going to church? Why aren't people using social capitals? Because they're not trained to know how to use it. We just assume they can. Just throw people in the park. They'll get along. People don't know how to interact, dang it. Like we're all like, it's really not given. And we're all in a trajectory of becoming less able to do it with technology. And the issue is we especially don't know how to interact with people different from us. It was hard enough when people were relatively similar and givens and it wasn't pluralism. Now they don't even share the same background. We don't know. We don't freaking know. And so then, of course, people just rationally go to distractions and movies and things because it's what else are they going to do? They don't know how to interact without hurting one another and all that other crap. So it leads to issue. The other thing that there's also something to be said, and I'll talk about language as membranics, but I'll give it to Michelle first. There's also something to be said about the importance of silence and prayer on the other side of speech. as opposed to speech. I think most people can emphasize silence or not speaking because they don't know how to speak. Whereas I think actually when you speak well, or in kind of the quality we're describing, you're actually able to enter a silence and a quality of not speaking that is only on the other side of speaking. But that means you have to go through the valley of death, the valley of risk, the valley of horror that is speaking to get to that silence that has a fuller quality. Right? Like there's something about actually the importance of facing the speak acts that affords you to enter into silence or prayer or the absence of speech that is more like dwelling in beauty as opposed to avoiding something you don't know how to do. And so for me, there's also something about learning articulation in this deeper sense that we mean, that's precisely in order to not be at the mercy of it, to be free in it, if you will. I mean, I would also argue that people not learning to speech, they're in their head all day. They're talking all effing day about how angry they are and how mad they are. They might not be saying anything, but in their head, they're talking constantly because they're mad at people and they're angry and they're kind of just voicing. So there's a funny way in which if you don't speak, you're going to be speaking in your head. Like if you don't learn this, you're going to be pissed off and speaking in your head, and you're actually not silent even if you look that way. If you don't want to have anger eat you alive, if you don't want to have reliving movies of how that person in the 5th grade screwed you, if you don't want that going on, there's something about this kind of speak act that is working through that in a certain processing. So to me, that's also a part of it, but I will stop and I will give it to Michelle. Michelle, please.
Yeah, thank you. This has all been so wonderful. I guess I would just want to reiterate your point, Daniel, where you're emphasizing, like, I thought I knew something, now I realize I don't know what I was talking about then. And I guess to me, it really speaks to like, it's almost like this realization of like, I need help to understand things better and to gather other perspectives, because I can get very pigeonholed in whatever it is how I'm thinking or whatever. And so when I have other people to hear the difference and the other perspectives, it's like, oh, okay, let me get out of my sort of self-relating negativity and get to a place of co-laboring and communion to be able to hear and to hopefully, basically, just like, I do think that we live in an age where we have sometimes questions and it's hard to know exactly where to get help on those questions. Like we're seeking wisdom on certain things or how to do this, maybe or whatever. And because again, especially like with Daniel, what we talk about with the loss of givens and sometimes also just, you can maybe have respect for certain people or your elders or whatever, but you do see that they may struggle with certain things, like maybe even conversation itself in their own dynamics. Then you're kind of like, it's hard, you're not sure where to go with the questions because if you go, but I think though, at the same time, it's not for the sake of avoiding conversation with anyone that such a place exists. It's actually, again, like it's been kind of hinted to, it's about being able to become more robust in your ability to talk to, your uncle who doesn't like philosophy or whoever it is, right? Whoever it is, that you can actually have conversation with them and learn how to get to the place where you can be open and listen to them. See what's the feedback loop you're getting in conversation with them, and how can you kind of show up in a better way, in a less defensive way, or in a less fearful way, or whatever. So yeah, I think there's just something where it's not just some sort of like nicety or an insular thing. It's really about seeking out, like, again, grappling with the questions that I think we all face as human beings, and wanting to do, like, and I don't know, people can, especially in the psychoanalytical world, that like the concept of improvement can be questioned, but I do believe in improving. Like I do believe in better and like actually learning to get stronger and learning to get more capable. And so for me, it's important to do that in this regard. Like this is the arena of exercise for your mind and for your ability to put yourself out there, because like Daniel's saying, it's hard. You have to be willing to say stuff that people may not understand and may not even agree with. But that's also the part of articulation. Like, yes, you can kind of almost have a fetish of articulation, but really it's also very hard. It's not easy to do that. It can take the bending and the twisting and the having to figure out how to get your words to come out so that it maybe hopefully makes sense. And then having to be okay with that and not kind of constantly having to try to explain yourself or be afraid that people misinterpreted it. It's like, well, that's the faith act right there, just to do it and to do your best, like, yes, work at it, but then also be willing to put it forth. And and then also know when, like you're saying, Daniel, when not to speak. When is it not the time to do the speaking? But I do think that conversation is in some ways it's hard to think of it as anything but like the lifeblood of relations is conversing, is communing. And if you can be like, yeah, well, we're just great being together silent with each other, okay, but are people like, people are usually distracted from one another, like they're scrolling their phones, they're watching some television thing, they're, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, then you're not really comfortable. Like, are you really comfortable being able to be with one another? Does that have a quality of experience that's feels wonderful, that feels geopathic, like Jockin and Javier and I have talked about before? That's where it's this earned ability to be silent, or earned ability to do the quiet, because you have actually tried your best to work on your own capacity to have conversation and to see it as a gift. It's actually a gift for yourself and to others. Like, you gift that. And I don't know, I just think that, like, I just watch the way people talk to each other, and it's such a source of pain for so many people, unfortunately. And that's why I think, like, there's almost a move to say, like, why do the net? It's because we believe conversation matters. It matters, and it can be something of a gift to one another. But you have to do it. You actually have to know what, like, you have to try to do, again, better. You have to try to do it in a way that actually you start to, like, look at your own assumptions and underlying beliefs, and you have to think about how to make a space that's hospitable to difference and to, like, articulations that aren't exactly how you would articulate it. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to say that as well. And yeah, I think I just, Christian's point about, like, not everyone's firefighters, I think that's a really good point. I also think, though, that most people will at some point in their life encounter that some belief is impacting their life to one degree or another. And if they don't have the skill to take the time to pause, right, and look at what that is, they will literally just be constantly hitting a wall or getting the same thing and not changing their recipe. And it's like, there's so much despair in that. There's so much hopelessness. And I really do think that people, every single person, if you're not actively, consciously doing philosophy, you're getting the secondhand smoke of philosophy, and you're still living it out. So I think that's why it does matter. I don't think it's merely, to me, I don't think of it as relegated to the firefighters. I think about everybody in their life kind of coming up upon the things that maybe they have to realize how to de-escalate, or how to essentially de-escalate, not just de-escalate, but not only de-escalate, but also how do you fan the flames? Like, how do you actually make the place of desire and enjoyment happen in your relations? But yeah, I think that at the same time, though, it's just a fact, though, that some people are not necessarily going to want to do it, right? They're not going to necessarily seek it out. And so I think maybe it's almost like, for those who maybe, if we could, to give homage to the concept of having firefighters, those are the people who try to help people in general be able to show a way, possibly, or to show that they could also be somebody who could do that. Or if not, maybe they, I don't know, Daniel and I talk about this term, it's almost like people get lucky, like people can just kind of get lucky, and they maybe didn't need to use the fire hydrant. But I think in a like fastly, what I mean fast in the sense of Verlio, like the speed that's continuing in our societies, the global pluralism, the internet, I just think that it's becoming more and more necessary. Unless you just literally shut off and just do a separatist move, which, okay, that's fair. Like, I guess that's just your choice. I think people didn't necessarily need to be firefighters before global pluralism and the internet, but I do think that now it is becoming much, much more necessary. And you just think about it like this. Okay, we have the technology that doesn't ever shut itself off. So you have to basically be the firefighter to say, shh, I'm gonna blow this thing's getting out of control. I think that's gonna start a wildfire. I've been doom scrolling for 5 hours. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, there you go. Like, even in a small example, I see that as relevant to learning firefighting skills and why it's important and why it's necessary. Not just for protection, but also for, like I said, fanning the flames of almost that the eros and the love and the passion of what relationships can really be. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, wonderfully put. Absolutely wonderful. And we have obligations this evening at the venue unfolding chairs. But if anyone has any final things to say before we go, there's certainly time. Perhaps we could say that everyone has to have a relation to food, but not everyone has to be a chef. Right. So something similar could be philosophy. And the more, and I do completely agree, the more you deal with technology and interconnectivity, the more that philosophy is necessary because of simply the probability of coming upon a complexity that is not automatically intelligible to you according to givens. And therefore, you have to decide freely how you're going to act, and no one can tell you what to do, and that tends to break people psychically. Like that's the what, like once you get complexity, you don't necessarily have, you don't know what to do. And the faster things get, the higher the probability you encounter things that you don't know what to do. And when that occurs, most people have a breakdown, or they dismiss, or they get rid of the thing to defend their map. And that, of course, eventually necessarily leads to violence at some point. So it becomes necessary. Now, there is something to be said, though, that if you everyone has a relation to food, but not everyone is a chef. But the people who are not chefs or don't know how to cook, they better hope the supply chain doesn't break down, right? Like someone who knows how to cook, they may not need the restaurants or people to make food for them because they can do it themselves. And then the chefs better hope they are hunters if the stuff really hits the fan, right? Like everyone has to take, in a sense, bets. It's like Lorenzo talking about portfolio financial epistemology or whatever, right? To what degree do you think the quote unquote supply chain is going to break down, right? Or could break down? Or what kind of risk do you want to take? Because it's, in a sense, risk taking. Like if you say, well, I don't think there's ever going to be a day where the supply chain show breaks down that we need to learn to hunt again. Okay, but I could see where going to restaurants is super expensive, so I'm going to learn how to cook. Okay, great. Someone else says, well, even if restaurants get super expensive, the time it would take to learn to cook, and when you think about the price at the grocery, it really kind of evens out. So I'm not going to learn to cook. I'm just going to go to restaurants. That's what I'm going to do, right? Now, that assumes that the restaurants will always work, but that's a risk I'm willing to take, right? But if you say, no, we got to learn how to hunt because the fiat currency is going down, Strait of Hormuz ain't opening, and I'm almost there, is that you need to learn how to do that, and you need to live. So it depends on what kind of risk you want to take. Right? And we've also talked about how there's something problematic with people who are preppers who are not really taking seriously the drones. But nevertheless, so likewise, there's something to be said with philosophy. If you say, well, I don't believe I need philosophy because I believe I'm not going to encounter that of which I will not be able to absorb into my ideology, or that's going to existentially overwhelm me. So you're like the person who doesn't learn to cook. You say you're going to take that risk. Okay, great. And you also say that I believe I'm going to use the internet in such a manner that does not lead to anxiety because I'm going to be careful on how I use it, and I'm not going to go down any rabbit holes. I'm not going to encounter things that make me question Christianity or atheism or whatever. I'm just going to take that. That's fine. But someone else says, well, I think there's a pretty good chance because that I'm going to encounter some difference. So I'm going to learn certain levels of humanitarian skills, or what do businesses have? Personnel, like people that help with human resources. I'm going to learn some levels of skill, and I'm going to learn how to deal with people. Okay, great. But then the other's like, no, you're going to encounter people who are like in entirely different worldviews, who think you're literally evil because you eat meat, and they're going to be your neighbor. Oh, if you think that's what's going to happen, then you're going to have to go much deeper into philosophy, right? So I'm of the opinion that the average person now has to be more on the side of deeper into than less, because the average person is more likely to encounter someone who is going to basically suggest their entire way of life is unethical, and they will be very tempted to demonize that person or even kill them. I also believe geopolitical complexity will go up, AI and so forth and so on, that people will be radically vulnerable to being swept up into things that then once they're swept up into, they're in huge trouble, right? So for that reason, given that risk portfolio, there is reason to believe that there needs to be more of the ability to handle complexity than not. Now, however, this is where I think the philosopher, though, as the sense maker, as Christian has talked about, can have a communal role, because you may only need, if you've got 20 people, you may only need one person of the extreme level for that community of 20 people, but that then assumes, and I think there could be various breakdowns of responsibility, but then you have to make that person intelligible to 20 people in their community, and you have to have the community has to be receptible to those things, right? And so you have that problem. So I think that's the point. And Michael, good to see you. We're talking about why we do this for episode 200. I'll throw it to Daniel here in a moment. The other thing I guess I'm thinking about now, look at that beautiful man. The other thing I'm thinking about is when we're talking about this silence, where people say, well, we can be silent together, we don't have to talk all the time. I think basically it comes down, and Sam talked about this, and I think about it very often, joint attention. Like, silence is not a virtue with other people. It's, are you capable of joint attention? The ability to attend something together. That creates intimacy. And that indeed can look like silence. But I believe the capacities for joint attention or sharing attention on something, or you could say creating a field together, is going to be on the other side of the work of communicating. Not, you can't skip that work. If you skip the work of communication, you're not going to have that joint attention in the same way. Like, you have to go through the work of speaking. And it's not by chance that you see therapy and stuff like Aspasia is doing all that kind of work is coming up, because there are many, many people that are finding themselves in a place, given the complexity of the work, where they have to do the work of speaking. And they're doing that in the aporia. That's right. They're doing that work because they find themselves in emotional intelligence, but not emotional maturity, as Michael and Aspasia were saying. And they have to do that work. And if they do that work, then you can find that joint attention. And furthermore, joint attention becomes harder to establish as you get diversity and complexity and difference and so on and so forth. There's also something to be said that we can certainly think, and Clayton, wonderful to see you, sir. We're talking about why we do this for episode 200. Thank you for coming by. There's also something to be said. I guess I'm also thinking about, I think we can very clearly, and Cadell has made these points, we can map on the political events occurring today relative to types of speech. Like, we'll talk about, like, the psychotic has weak speech. They feel like they're never able to speak and it has authority, so they self-relate with themselves, right? Well, a way that people, but then they're isolated. Well, a way people are dealing with that is strong speech, which is basically the FU speech of a Nick Fuentes, Trump, all these people. It's like the strong speech asserting itself, right? I think basically what we have is a world caught between an oscillation of strong speech and weak speech, and all our political options reflect that, because people have not learned the art of speech, of which affords the possibility of joint attention that allows different social and political options. We can certainly see what happens in a world that doesn't do the work of speech in the way that we are describing. It manifests socially and politically. And then everyone is attracted to the strong man who has the strong speech, who's just going to say what everyone wants to say. And that's what they connect with. Because when people speak, they are looking for forms of resonance, like resonance in different things, right? Like, you'll have these dialogos, as Vereki says, and there's a certain resonance that emerge. There's a certain satisfaction that comes from that affords, I think, the development of subjectivity, attention, and friendship, and so forth and so on, that many people don't have that experience. And so they get it. The closest thing they can get to it is the shared anger of strong speech. Yeah, that feeling. Yeah, tell them. So what ends up happening is when people don't have access to speech that is able to create resonance or connection in the way that we're describing and that we work for at the net, they're going to look for it, because speech and belonging go together strongly. People feel belonging where they can speak or be heard or communicate. And if they don't have a taste of speech that is able to create the geopathic, as you, Michelle, and Javier and Jockin have talked about, they're either going to retreat into the hikikomori, they're going to retreat into the psychotic, or they're going to look for the strong man that makes them feel connection via shared emotion and the mob. And that's just going to continue to be our oscillation unless we do the work. More to be said, but let me throw it to Daniel and then Christian here, and anyone else who wants to speak. Daniel, please.
Yeah, it's really hard to appropriately emphasize the value of speech, or like what speech is, like what it's even like your attempt to emphasize that you're bound by it, and so it has this phenomena that has drawn many people to personify it, deify it, even like the goddess of speech, or like the word. It's incredibly I don't even want to say important. It's hard to emphasize it appropriately. I don't know how. Like just two images that have come to mind that I think are on the threads, and then also just saying that Cadell came up the other side of the speech would be the writing. And I know that I've immensely benefited in the last few months by being afforded through Philosophy Portal a space for writing in a particular context, unbound from institutional affiliation, and it's speaking and writing. I mean, we know this, obviously. We know that these skills, but I mean the bang for the buck, and there's no buck in it, for writing or speaking. It's so the two images, like the first one is Socrates. I'm just saying Clayton's thing there about speech and nonverbal, and yeah, I mean it's really the there's this notion of like seed mantras, or like seed syllables, that are just incredibly interesting to play with by themselves, and like what does speech have at the level of audibility, and then what is the repetition of a word in a non-audible level? Like, is that, I mean, some cosmologies would like essentialize sound completely, like the universe is sound, and people play with this in a scientific way. I find in my own country, I'm essentially monolinguistic. I'm very bad at Afrikaans. I can greet and stuff in other ways, but there's a lot of gestural, nonverbal communication, skill of greeting that really goes a far way. And then I think like part of the fascination from of foreign language, or maybe even like this a Western fascination with stuff coming from the East, or just the fascination that we have with words that are strange or foreign, is because we can enjoy the sound of it with having like that a bit of distance from the meaning, and then you're playing with speech in a different manner. And yeah, there's also, I mean, I'm surprised that I'm remembering this now, but I was like someone was saying what shunyata is, or what emptiness is. So then they say like emptiness is shunyata. So they're saying like emptiness is, but that minimal difference of language affords a certain looking at the thing, that just the minimal difference of a different word, a different culture, you can, and especially when it's when you're trying to point at something immediate, or mediate through your concept as something that is immediate, that's so proximal that the is move is too much, then that's helpful. But then you get locked into the A is A that Daniel often speaks about, and you're not appreciating the way in which concept moves into difference or otherness. But the I've also been fascinated recently by the kind of calligraphy, the shape of letter, even the shape of a letter, and then when you're playing with sound, with the shape of lettering itself and speech, and then where you're feeling the speech and the sound and your breath, like that calligraphy stuff becomes incredibly interesting. Like I found out I was playing with the shape that is W or E or M. Well, it's like the same shape, you're just moving it around in its verticality. And then when you're drawing, when you're writing that, when you're using your hands to make those shapes, it's the rotational symmetry there from Thomas. There's something about that, I'm like gesturing now, but my hand would be mirrored if I had to, but like that with the W, and then even the M, like the M, the way that the M closes. So when you make an OM, you don't even have to say the M. You can just kind of let it finish here, and the sound does it naturally. Like you go or, and then the momentum of the sound closes itself into an M, and in that system or I don't even want to say system, like just that's the individual aspect. So that if you when you're letting the M close on itself, you try and like really find the point, like where's the point that it localizes, like that it really, now this is like it's your articulation, you articulate your calligraphy, like how fine can you place that point, and that's a gestural articulating capacity that. And I'm just thinking about now, like if you're in an interpersonal context, like when there's a cultivation of this proficiency in speech and you give a word to someone, just that sensitivity or that placement of something, of emphasis, it can really go it can go a far way. The images that I thought I was going to say, and then I got surprised by this whole thread. There's it's a Socrates. I think it's in like the Meno, and I think I could be corrected. Thomas probably be the one to correct me. Like Socrates is in another city for the context of the dialogue, and so he's having conversations with citizens there. And there's something happens where an Athenian, where Socrates is from, is asked the same question that one of the citizens of this other city-state was asked, and the Athenian just like laughs. It's like, because the question is something like, what is this virtue, or what is that? And the laughing is basically because like us in Athens, like we've been interrogated and brought into this way of philosophy, such that like we've been humbled to the fact that we don't know. So Socrates was poor, but he was ruling. There's a certain rulership. He didn't have political power. He was killed by the political power, but he had a rulership in Athens through his philosophy, and then he gives us that gesture of how worthwhile that life actually is by giving up his life rather than forsaking that life of philosophy. I mean, that's quite a statement as to what the thing is that he's doing, and there's also something about that danger in like philosophy proper is in a antagonistic relationship with power proper. That's a real. So there will be aversion because of that reality to the practice or to doing it. Because when you're doing it, you're interrogating things that are going to displace you or put you into strange positions in relationship to the way that you fall into authority and hierarchy structures. So it's the emotional challenge, the existential aspect of philosophy and inquiry is not something that it's also something you can't understate, because it's part of the very aversion to the thing. If I have to think about this or confront it, my life can change. And the last image is just I've been thinking about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee process that happened end of apartheid, and a space for speech and disclosure in speech, and like incredible how much that can do and did do. And then just the amnesia or the forgetfulness or the fog or not appreciating what is actually functional in that, or like what's operating there, and then somehow not being able to fit that into value or government or like it's just not speaking the value structure of even the well-meaning public benefit organizations. You have to translate it into some metric or something that misses the whole. Almost swore. I almost swore because it's like it's frustrating. I mean, I last thing I'll say, I had a bit of a there's a I was reading a corporate email. Someone close to me said having trouble in the company. And it's just like gobbledygook. Like to me, it's to me like, are you serious? Like, it's just insane. The languaging that is being and I could express this. Actually, it was a bit of a faux pas because I was laughing about some stuff that the person was involved in, and but the same person has like it gets on my case when I speak about philosophy or something. It's like, what is that? That's so complex. So yeah, market, yeah, that's my value proposition.
Magnificent, magnificent. Thank you for sharing all that. I'll throw it to Christian, Jockin, and then Michael. Just a few things. What you were saying about the curvature, the speech, like all of that, I think is extremely important. The key, it's design and architecture all the way down, all the time. And you are designing in speech. You're not merely exchanging definitions. This is where we'll talk about with Derrida, like there was that idea that the signifier can never cross the gap of the signified. Therefore, metaphysics is dead because you have the gap between those different things. But my giant argument is that I would argue that metaphysics is found in the moment that TAC becomes CAT, and intelligibility arises suddenly because I've designed the words correctly. That moment of intelligibility, you grasp it, you apprehend it. We've talked about this before. You don't go, oh, hold on, Dan, let me look up the definition of CAT. Oh, cat, got it. No, that's not what happens, dang it. I meet a condition of saying the words cat or spelling it on the paper, and intelligibility arises, which points to nous, as Mr. Jockin has talked about. Furthermore, when I'm talking to you, I am designing or meeting certain conditions so that intelligibility can arise between us. It is designed all the way down. And the reason why this is very important, because something similar occurs when you stand on that spot of the room versus over there. When you invite people over, you're constantly coordinating, you're constantly designing, and you're constantly changing how spaces unfold or how intelligibility arises, and how things unfold changes how intelligibility arises. That's what we're perpetually doing. You may associate this with being a steward in the Genesis sort of sense, right? You're always, what you're critically doing, there's a sense in which it is not so much that we are giving one another ideas or intelligibility, although of course that is in a sense true, versus what we're doing is creating conditions to where intelligibility or new ideas arises, just like that. It just kind of appears. So likewise, you're designing rooms or you're constantly coordinating and designing everything. That's what we really are fundamentally as humans. And what design works for what people depends on what language they know and the contingency. So coordination, design, architecture, conditionalism. These are all the things we're in the business of. And we've made a massive mistake to emphasize intelligibility as a transfer of definitions to one another, because of course your language philosophy is going to translate into your entire philosophy of ideas. That's why so many philosophers have emphasize language philosophies. We've seen it when really what we are doing is creating conditions. Like if I suddenly talk really quietly, you can't hear what I'm saying, can you? Because I didn't meet the condition of speaking at a voice you could hear, right? If I start, and adding a lot of ums and spacing, then I'm infecting your ability to make condition. Notice you can be speaking and skip words or not pronounce them correctly like I do all the time. And yet nevertheless, people can get what you're saying, right? How is that possible? It turns out that language is more of meeting adequate conditions. They don't have to be perfect. They have to be adequate conditions to bam. And that's what we're perpetually doing. Intelligibility does not work like we think it does. We think it works for humans at least. We think it is a download, upload process because we've overfit that metaphor from computers, not that computers are bad, when really it is more like a shared magic trick, dang it, a shared sort of emergence of things occurring, but it's designed all the way down. And if that's the case, the problem is it is not self-evident what design or condition is best. And really, again, I think if you go into marriages, if you go into businesses or relationships, I have more notes, but I'll throw it to Christian. And instead of thinking, what's the right thing I can say? Or what is the right thing I can do? Instead, you kind of ask, what are the conditions that I can create by which the right thing can emerge on its own? What's the environment that I can put forth so that connection can happen? Not how do I create connection, but instead thinking more of what design, what conditions, what way of speaking can occur where we find ourselves in relationship, or we find ourselves in forgiveness, or find ourselves in intelligibility. That is a different way of thinking. Humans are not beings of whom function well when they are direct. We function well when we are indirect because we're supposed to create gardens and environments in which things bloom, not try to act like one another or machines that we can tune with a wrench. Machines have a role in helping us garden. I can tell you I regret not having the automatic tiller. But once we start to think that one another can be treated by the same onto-epistemological method, we get a lot of overfitting and trouble. But I will pause and throw it to Christian here. Christian, please.
I think your garage elves are back.
Yeah, they're definitely back.
Okay. Yeah, a few things came together for me in a way that I thought was nice, so I'll share it. And thank you. Okay, so this space being one where we're exploring ideas, as the theme has largely been, trying things out, seeing what works, a lot from you, Daniel, at least. You've been saying this. What works for one person doesn't work for another person. And it's like such a good example, in Michelle's response to my firefighter thing. And so I was like, oh, well, my firefighter thing didn't work as well as I wanted it to. Because I think I agree with Michelle. It's like a chef, right? Versus just your average person who needs food. And maybe the middle ground there is like someone maybe should know how to cook as well, even if they're not necessarily discovering new recipes. And that's trying to get more clear on the point I was trying to make. It's like I see a space like the net as being one where you have to show up with certain, I think, certain capacities, a certain amount of literacy. You have to speak English, at least. And often like switching between metaphors very fluidly. And like, it's a very kind of creative conversation where you have to have a certain kind of stamina and faculty, I want to say. So that's what I was trying to get at with this, in pointing to something like specialization. But to Michelle's point, I think we live in a world where no one's taken like fire safety 101, and we need that too. And so then to tie that in with the point about silence, I wanted to well, at least when I use this idea of like this kind of sacred presence kind of silence, I want to not just place it at the end of conversation, but like put it there with, and sometimes before even. I was getting to reflect on something the other day in a conversational circle, which was an experience I had when I was 19, which was after moving out of my parents' house, falling in with a group of friends, and smoking pot for the first time. And for the first time in my life, feeling comfortable just being quiet with a group of people. And it was like a small group of people. They're the only people I felt comfortable smoking marijuana with, because I knew I could just be quiet with them, and not in a kind of distracted in my own head, detached from them, but actually like very present with them in a way that I had never been with anyone. like learning what it feels like to just be in like observation mode and like this like pure openness where I don't feel a compulsion or a social demand to be like, you know, articulating basically, was this huge, beautiful, I would say, healing experience, learning experience. I mean, it's in some sense, I was like learning to bring that pause into the conversational environment, right? Like I am learning what it feels like to feel comfortable, even when I'm not thinking about, you know, I'm not chasing thoughts, nor am I, oh, hey, little baby. The baby is an example of silence with us. Um, and not necessarily needing to engage in the conversation without feeling like, oh, I'm being like anti-social or I'm not pulling my weight or something like this. It's just like, no, I'm just here and appreciating. And so, you know, I think what I hope people get more of, to Michelle's point, because I do think we're at a moment in history where we are sorely lacking spaces and skills for relating and thinking and relating with people who disagree with us and all these things, feeling seen and heard. I love the collective presencing social technology so much because it's you're kind of talking about this before, Daniel, about like structures in which we can make certain kinds of conversations happen. All right, and this is one that kind of cooks the pause into it as a rule in a very interesting way that's super simple but very effective, I find. And it's something I'm going to try to see if I can get my family to do with me, which is it's a risky move, right? But it's for the exact reason you said, Daniel. It's you know, there are people who, because they don't have those opportunities, they exactly are having they need those moments of connection via proxy, right? It's almost like a form of prostitution, but let's maybe more generally say it's like a drug. It's a drug that's out there. There's lots of it available on YouTube, where let's be angry together. Anyway, so yeah, I'm really interested to see how this lands with folks who've never tried it before. But yeah.
Outstanding. I think that is very brave, but also important work and effort to engage in. I definitely think a lot about the right way to introduce, like that kind of introduce or bringing in. And I think that is itself an art form that requires doing this for many years and 200 episodes or ebooks or what. Like, actually, it's so funny. Like, perhaps the greatest philosophical challenge, if we use that term, philosophical or conversational, is not the ability to know what Hegel says in The Science of Logic, but knowing how to bring people who don't do this kind of thing into a place where they do it or appreciate it or are open to it. Like, that skill actually often seems more difficult than becoming a Hegel scholar or a Heidegger scholar or someone. And I actually think that skill or that moment or that activity is something that I personally, and I think many people in the space, are at least subconsciously interested into, and that can be interested in. And that also, I think, can be a reason why conversations about family, therapy, psychoanalysis, and all of that overlap with these conversations, because there's a sense that those capacities are part of figuring out the introduction. And we've talked about the introduction problem and the bringing into. And you could argue this is a very, very old problem of religions and churches and things like that. And adorable, Sartori, straight adorable. But the other thing I'm now thinking about as well is I really like what you were saying about the recipe. I think that's great. Not everyone needs to know how to make new recipes. And I think you're correct. Spaces like this have a certain experimentation to it. Not everyone needs to know how to make something new, but it's important that some people are. And there's some sort of gradient there. But, you know, it's just another example, like what you were saying there about silence. There's a kind of silence that actually makes possible speech. And then with speech, you see, that's a wonderful example of I completely agree. And yet what I said before didn't sound like I would agree. You know how in these conversations, there's always this feeling of, do we ever disagree, or like, do we ever disagree? I think one of the reasons you can get that effect is because when you have people gathered, I'll say like we gather here, often what it is that it's like a expanding circle, or it's like a landscape where the mist is covering some of it, and you're articulating a piece, but then someone else says something and you go, oh, that's another part of the landscape. And it really is not that you disagree or agree. I would even say agree. Is that, okay, that mist is now moved. Okay, that map has been filled in. Because what I would say is, to me, as you're speaking, what I want to say is that there's a silence necessary for speaking that many people don't even do that silence. So they don't even get through that and go to, and that's a problem. But then there's also a silence or joint attention on the other side of speaking that has similar structure to the silence before speaking, but it has a different quality. It's like the return we talk about with Hegel, Hume, like to go to the place of your beginnings to know it for the very first time, right? And I think there's something with silence. Like, it's very dangerous for people to get together to talk who never have silence before they talk, or don't learn how to be silent, because then the speaking is almost destined to be that nervous speech, right? So silence is really important. But then there is a silence afforded because you've done the work of speaking. That is a kind of return to the silence before speaking, but now you bring someone else. Like, you're bringing someone else with you, right? And actually, you could start speaking without changing the quality, because you learn how to, it's like it has the same kind of mystical quality as the silence that you started in. And so there's something there where, again, like as you were speaking, I'm constantly interested in that dynamic. And then I'll throw it to Jockin here, and then Michael, and if anyone has anything else to say on this fine day, and I will talk about the membranic stuff, is that why you don't disagree so much in these conversations, and why sometimes there's even a certain inappropriateness to making a point to disagree, right? Like, because some people, I think there's a nervousness. We haven't disagreed enough. Let's disagree or else it's all fake and we're in a conspiracy. There's a nervousness to, you want to disagree to validate, but that's the wrong spirit, and it kind of kills the whole thing if you do that. Another metaphor I often go to that I actually think describes this work is stuff like, there are many myths, like Lot's wife, don't look over your shoulder, she'll turn to salt. There's the looking down, Peter, and you sink into the water. Like, there's all these myths in history of these kind of ideas that if you give into a temptation to be sure, to get reassured, then the whole thing falls apart. I think that can happen with disagreement, where people want to disagree to feel confident that they're not just blowing smoke. But in doing that, it turns the whole thing into salt, because it, it's like Lot's wife. Likewise, people can bring in difference for difference sake or whatever, like, because what they're really looking for is a feeling of validation, or they're looking to make sure that they're not just making themselves believe something they already believe. But that very nervousness kills the spirit of the space. And so I think it's actually very important to move from that metaphor to realize that what we're dealing with is, it's more like we have a landscape covered in fog. We can't articulate every time we speak. But as we speak, the other person in the group, I think if they're in the correct orientation, will actually say, well, actually, there's some landscape over here we need to clear. Oh, right. Okay. And you're doing that work. You could say cleaning a field, harvesting, but that, I think, is part of why you get this feeling of, are we always agreeing? Because we're working together. Like, if you're working together with people, then it will feel like you're always agreeing. Yeah. If you're working with someone, if you're working together with people, the overall feeling should be, we're helping one another. But notice you're not always agreeing all the time. People are saying, well, what about? But even when people say, what about, we don't emotionally register it as disagreeing, because the thing that the spirit by which they're saying, what about, is from one of co-laboring. And we're not used to that being disagreement, or that's not what we think. So then we're nervous that we're always disagreeing with one another. And because we've been kind of absorbed the categories of debate, we're looking to confirm what we're doing according to those categories to make sure that we're not just creating a cult. And as a result, that nervousness destroys the entire space. But really what you're doing is you're working together to clear the fog, or to fill in the map, or to explore the territory. And so what ends up happening is that you're co-laboring together, and the disagreements are for the clearing of that territory. And that creates a very, very different dynamic. And people disagree all the time, but they disagree more like someone who says, you didn't fill in this part of the map. If I say you didn't fill in this part of the map, am I disagreeing with you? In a certain sense, I'm disagreeing with you in so much as you act like the map is filled in. Like, there's a certain disagreement there. It's like, okay, I would disagree with you if you're acting as if what you said about silence, Daniel, is the sum total, right? But it's not really disagreement. It's like you didn't fill in this part, right? And it's like, oh, you're right, I didn't fill in that part. And actually, I've had experience that confirms that. So we're filling in one another, right? That dynamic is something that people are not emotionally used to. And I think as a result, they destroy many spaces like this because they want to get the affirmation that they're substantive and not just confirming their ideologies. And so they cheap. It's like cheap disagreement versus costly disagreement. And as a result, in the name of making sure that they're not brainwashing, they wash everything away. So I really appreciate what you were saying. There's more to be said, but I will give it to Jockin and then Michael and then Clayton. Mr. Jockin, please.
Well, I say hello to Paul. He's hanging out in the background. I see him.
Yeah, he loves the garage. It's his favorite place.
Good times. Obviously, I think. See, I was coming on to talk about what other Daniel was talking about with the calligraphy. Obviously, the minute he talked about that, I wanted to jump in, because the big thing about obviously the bodily gestually interaction of the instrument on paper, the resistance of the paper, and the kind of embodiment of motion through space, the geometric movement across the space, all the sensitivity about it. I think a good example in the net is, as was brought up, was the idea of metaphoric play of thought. Like we're using images of thought to play through different domains, different dimensions. So for example, like when I heard Daniel talking about calligraphy, I'm thinking, all right, it's the relationship of silence or absence with presence. Because maturity in calligraphy is your awareness of very much the space between the marks, as much as in the marks themselves. That position of the mark is dependent on its position out, its spacing between the other marks. You don't get an M versus an N versus an I if they're all collapsed into each other. You can't get that. You need absence spaces. You have to carry the arc. And actually, usually for things like M and N, for example, or the italic W, when you do a cursive form, there's an arc motion that has to be done. You have to kind of follow trajectory, kind of a motion movement, and kind of carry and hold pregnantly that negative space, that absence space. That's what actually gives the presence, the reality of the word being articulated. I can't help but obviously I need to point out that calligraphy in its Greek is beautiful writing or beautiful marking, right? So like, this is also why I find it very, it's a very fun image. Just pull it up. There's no strong argumentation about it I can say about at the moment, but I just like that image being presented. Yeah, I think in general, right, the yes and orientation, the kind of improvisation, the yes anding quality of the net. Obviously, I've seen that it's very generative, right? As opposed, obviously, I think part of the reason why my colleagues at this school did not get on board with what I was talking about is because the discourse space of academics is absolutely not the space of generative making. Absolutely not. It's the confirmation of a map. That's exactly what it is. So that's why it's so done. The people who spoke the most vocal in that group was my mentor, like is my chair, the fine art professor, and me, the graphic design professor. We were the ones who were replying back to the committee or to the panel about the nature, and we both were talking about this quality of the subjectivity to respond to difference and to failure and tension and the receptivity of discussion. Like, it totally fell on deaf ears completely. You know what the response was to me? Oh, you got to meet the students where they're at. Like, this is basically just like, we need to basically we got to give some sugar, right, in the medicine. That's basically what needs to happen here. Like, we know the truth and we need to stamp it on these people. I think a lot of times discourse spaces tend to operate that way. There's different degrees of intensity, sometimes more explicitly than others. But I kind of want to point out that's actually what the net is doing is very much not that, right? So I think that's very fair. I do want to point out that again, pointing out a little tension, at least in my mind about this, Daniel, is, there are, let me put it this way. There's certain kinds of thinkers who show up in this space, a tendency, certain kinds of speakers versus others who are not here. And there's lots to discuss, and like the particularities don't really matter, but I just want to draw out that I think some of that anxiety, I don't disagree with that reading of it, that it is an anxiety. Why are we not disagreeing? It's because how we just is that concern of, are we just all just overlapping our maps enough, like there's enough overlap in our maps so that the disagreements don't show up, or when they do show up, they can be mediated because there's enough overlap, right, in the thinking or the map or territories we're all coming from. So I'm chewing on that a little bit. I do think you have an answer to it, Daniel, is that generally the typical answer is, when we encounter those points, we ask the how might we's, like what does it signify, and what is the different orientations about it. I think also a lot of times it's not about like confirming the map per se. It's like, here's the map, stamp it down. It's a lot of times it's weighing. I think it's a lot of weight. I think it's generally people discount how much it's not the facts or even the principles or even the maps that are the issue. It's the weighing of it to the particular circumstances. So that's why you think your images of the landscape and a fog moving around is very important, because that fog and the weight and the density of that fog, or the weight of where we place things and positionality, does affect a lot. I think a lot of people don't realize that. So you can everyone can basically, which is, I think in shorthand sometimes says the emphasis problem. I've heard some conversation about that, where certain people emphasize certain aspects versus others. But the point I'm talking through. I think the charge against a space like the net is that, one, you have to come with background, you have to come with foreknowledge, you have to be already agenic, you have to be a high agency individual who has an account, a very developed account, or relatively developed, but is willing to enter a play space of basically geopedia, right? Geopedia play of discourse spaces, to have this kind of imaginative play, thinking through together, generatively together. A lot of spaces don't operate that way because of the presumption of map making, map stamping, right? Or along that way, that a lot of times they think that the debate space is just maps colliding with each other, and that's how you generate truth, right? So, which is also pointing out what we're arguing here is a very different kind of truth generation, which is actually a point I wanted to make about with Christian way back, like 30 minutes ago, 45 minutes ago. When I said about logos, right, that kind of interplay, the play of words, kind of a generation of truth from that play. I actually want to point out one aspect to it, right? Because Heidegger, especially a Heideggerian stance, would be very much against that, because that's very much a kind of correspondence argument of truth. Like, it could be read that way. I do think the counterplay is actually when that logos, the play of words in the kind of discourse space, when there's a counterfactual. That's where really the play happens. That's where truth shows up. So when that contact happens of a counterfactual, that's when the dance happens. That's when the little sparks happen. Because now I think that, at least for me, my thinking about this is, it's in that encounter of the counterfactual of when there's a breakdown or tension, where now the interplay starts to play out of like how we articulate and refine our accounts and play with each other. So these are just things I'm chewing about at the time. I don't have any other. I don't know how that landing stuck, but that's my thoughts at the moment.
No, absolutely outstanding. I love what you were saying on weighing. I think you're correct that the universities are in huge trouble because it's just a lot of map making and map sealing or map defending, and thus the tracing out of internally consistent systems, and that's no good. I think the yes and dimension is extremely important. Improv, where most of the time there is simply institutional, egoic, etc., status incentives to say no. Yes and could be a threat to your status, right? And so, well, this gets into why I think thought at this point in the age absolutely is more likely to occur outside of institutions. Not that institutions are bad. I think we're going to see a certain reforming occur in the outside. The outside is now in a position to reform the inside, and then back and forth, and so on and so forth. I think what you're saying look, one of the reasons why I think doing this regularly and continually is really important is because it's like, yep, I thought I had a grip, I hated to lose. I thought I had a grip on them, and I was entirely wrong. And I had to keep doing this, and I don't have a good grip on Blondel, and I feel embarrassed about that. Gadamer, I was looking at Anscombe, Nishashanti, Japanese thinker, all the, I've fallen behind on all my Hinduism thinkers, and I was a freaking concentrate in that. There's something about the very fact that you are leaving out so many people. You're leaving out so many people, and yet you've done this for 200 episodes. Is that, and actually, I think when you understand that this creates friendship and develops subjectivity, that becomes exciting versus terrifying. That becomes something that's great and intrinsically motivated and a source of drive versus something of terror. I think basically the same thing happens in institutions. Not that you're not saying this, Mr. Jockin, but it's hidden via specialization and keeping out the organic. So then it's like, well, the reason I'm always talking about Hegel is because that's my specialty. Well, maybe that's just because you don't like look into other. Have you looked at every other thinker and determined that's the best? You don't get asked that because you're defended from that question by your very specialization. In this kind of space, you're naked to it. You're exposed to it, right? And so there's two questions. One, do the thinkers that keep coming up because of bias, or do they keep coming up because they're the ones that we have found are the ones that more likely than not, or more often, are more useful or more likely to come to bear upon the situations we find in our life that we're encountering, and we're looking for something to try to get an articulation around it. So that problem you just described, which is a major problem, which means we need to like do this forever and keep learning and keep working and encounter the limits, and also have different accounts running up against one another to make us realize that our understanding of Gadamer, Plato, Plotinus, or whoever is not as good as we thought. So you have to do that. But a reason why I think not picking a topic and having the topics you talk about emerge from life versus ahead of time. Say, we're going to get together and talk about Hegel, or get together and talk about Derrida or something, or Nietzsche or blah, blah, blah. The likelihood of that mistake, because of the pre-configuration of the space, is quite high. Like, to overfit. You're more likely to overfit because you've invested in that one discourse, right? But if you're mostly talking about the fact that in marriages, people constantly misunderstand each other, and in doing that, you find yourself reaching for Hume, not because you planned it, but because the thing that comes up seems to go in the direction of Hume or brings Aristotle. And then more often than not, you're reaching for Aristotle versus Gadamer or someone. Because, yeah, you read other people, but you find yourself using some more than others. There would be greater reason to think, because of the open-endedness of the space, that the people that are being reached for, that very reaching is the testing of their perhaps, I want to say superiority or betterness, because they are the ones of whom you go to when you don't have to. Maybe not. You can never get certainty about that. And that actually should be a source of self-questioning that keeps you questioning yourself, so you keep developing and keep working, right? But I don't actually think, like, when people want to determine the quote-unquote canon, or determine who are the best theologians or philosophers or whoever, there's two things that we've had in history that have actually, in my opinion, hindered the meaningful coordination and assortment of that question. First, the people we talk about was set by the institutions, and we didn't have a social coordination mechanism by which random people could find random thinkers and bring to, hey, did you know about Michel Planier? Did you know about, like, YouTube allows you to encounter all these thinkers you didn't have before. To encounter them, you just had to have happened to have taken a college class where they taught those people, and that was not very likely, right? But now it's more likely you find the thinkers that people don't know about. And look how many thinkers are becoming, like Michel Planier, who I read in like 2010 and nobody knew about. I'm hearing his name all the time now. Because this space and these spaces in online allowed people to find him, then talk about him, and then people heard it and say, that connects with my marriage issues, that connects with my life situations, and so the name kind of spreads. So what you get now is a kind of social natural selection, I almost want to say, that is possible because of the rate of coordination and discourse by which we can actually see which names arise, which stick and which stay, that allows a flow, kind of a flow of all of the different thinkers by which we can actually see which thinkers have thought to bear that is perhaps more valuable than not. Now, I don't want to push that too much because there's always dangers in talking about hierarchies. And of course, Gadamer could be the best in the world to help you address issue X, and no one else can do it as well as Gadamer, but everything else, you'd be better off to go to Hume, right? You always have that issue. But all of that, those kind of questions of hierarchy and best or whatever, like, to get beyond them, because hierarchies always have a coordination problem. Like, if you have limited time, who are you going to study? Well, you ought to study Plato and Aristotle because they're the best, and that's a kind of a time allocation issue, especially if you only have 4 years in college before work, and so better get the best of the best, or who you're going to get the most bang of the buck. Those coordination compromises are no longer so necessary. And so now I think we actually have the conditions of possibility by which we can meaningfully sort of, dare I say, have a competition between all of the different thinkers and minds for the sake of extending humanity, not for the sake of making some list on the History Channel by which we can, say our guy's number one or whatever. No, we can actually order the quality of thought for the sake of articulating and meeting the conditions by which to unleash the fullness of life. And I think that is now possible. And I think it is more likely in spaces that don't have a top-down labeling or stuff like that. And that's why these kind of organic encounters, and then having the topics be that of which people are encountering in their lived lives, and then who do they just happen to grasp for or go to by which to articulate their lived experience, that becomes a truer test, if you will, than simply these are the people who have been selected for the 101 class in philosophy that leave out a whole lot of problems. And that's where this technology takes seriously things like Derrida warning about canons and Herrera and all the postmodernists warning about those things, but not ending up in a deconstruction that leaves us with nothing. But I think it's a real tension that you're describing, Mr. Jockin, and I think it's very important to articulate, but I'll pause and throw it to Michael and then Clayton if anyone else has final things. Michael, please.
Yeah, this has been excellent. It makes me think of something Christian was talking about earlier, I think near the end of his commentary about the different onto-epistemologies that we all have, being able to co-labor towards something that exists beyond, the map. And, you've spoken about that at length, Daniel. I also wanted to, in the spirit of kind of just playing with metaphors, I wanted to play a little bit with the chef idea and the making food idea, because I was just thinking about that in the context of this conversation that I recently had with a loved one who's a very passionate, devout Christian, and I'm seeing someone right now who's not a Christian, and she was talking about the unequally yoked idea from Corinthians, and kind of about, she had this very direct stance of that I'm disobeying God's will and all of that. So I've just been sitting with that little small thing of disobeying God's will the last few days. And I think like we all come from particular contexts that have certain ideas about how to make good food, right? In some cultures, spicier food is at a premium. In some cultures, it's, sweet, umami. Some cultures, it's more bland. Some cultures, are a lot heavier on meat and potatoes. Some, and like how to balance a diet and all of that. So like there's like how to work creatively with the ingredients that you have to not just make a good meal, but to constantly innovate. But then we also have these like cultural kind of like maxims, if you will, or like kind of rules or assertions about what food tastes good. So like, Daniel's on the call, and we both have South African ancestry, and my mom's from the Cape region, which has a lot of or kind of more in like the Durban area, has a lot of like Cape Malay influence from Indonesia, different parts of South Asia, and they love among other things, they love sweet and savory together. So like one of my mom's favorite dishes to make as a kid, which I never wanted to eat, was an omelet with minced meat and bananas. It was just like really bizarre. And I like, it was like a few years ago, and she was like, oh, like, she'd really only make it if we didn't have like anything else in the house. And she was like, oh, do you want this? And I was just like, yeah, just sure. And it was so good. And like one of my favorite dishes growing up was called babuti, which is like minced meat with you pour eggs on top and you bake it and then you serve it with chutney. And in a different culture, like sweet and savory would, like it wouldn't be something that people would enjoy. It would be kind of, yeah, you keep those separate, one's for dinner, one's for dessert or something. And so it's like there's like different onto epistemologies or something about, and these and cultures have like been used to a certain way of eating, and they're genetically, like their palates and their taste buds have been enculturated to like certain foods, and then just different parts of the world just don't have access to different types of food. So it's like in a global pluralistic world where there's now fusions of different cuisines, and new cuisines are being birthed, food purists hate that shit, because they're like, there's this like Japanese tapas place on my street, which is so good. But I can imagine someone who either likes Spanish food or likes Japanese food being like incensed about that or something. And so, yeah, to kind of bring it back to like the larger conversation, like there's an ability with everyone at the net to come in with certain maps, or at least like a scaffolding of a map, which is important to have, because if you don't have that, then you don't have the subjectivity and kind of the interior like integrity to be able to interface with these like ideas, and to kind of know where you land on them, how they resonate with you, and that goes to like Seth's work and Daniel and Aspasia's work, hopefully my work one day, of like engaging with the body, engaging with the felt senses of how different things land for you. But then there's also an ability to have an easefulness with that, such that new like thoughts of how to make, I think the like back to the food analogy, like there's some chefs that only look at food in terms of good food and bad food, and like, does this taste good, does this work, as opposed to, oh, like you can't put cayenne with cumin or whatever, like just because that's like the rules. There's like a sense of like what tastes, yeah, like what, and we talk about like having taste in music or having taste in whatever, and at least the people that I've observed that I think genuinely have good taste don't have prejudice and bias about like, oh, like this, you can't, you just can't put these genres together because like you just can't. They have this, they've transcended that, they like have this felt sense intuition of like what actually works. And I've just been thinking a lot about like the difference between like mere adherence to biblical rules or or commandments, as opposed to faith. And I think like I was just thinking of like, if you look at, and you've mentioned this before, Daniel, and other people have, is like there's a strong likelihood that if you are of one faith, just say Christianity, that you will encounter a fellow Christian that you disagree with more than a Muslim or a Jew that actually approaches faith in a very similar way to you. And if that's true, that means that faith is much more than adherence to rules. Because if that was the case, then we would all just be doing the exact same thing. We would we would be merely like modeling, like mimetic desire. We would just merely be like mirrors of each other, doing the same things, following the same rules. But because that's not the case, that means that God works in infinitely different and mysterious and unique ways for each person. And so, you know, the rules are like the map that help guide you, that give you, I don't know, I might get in hot water with with some Christians, I don't know, for making it sound like, oh, I'm just one of those people that like customizes. It's like I'm like at a buffet or something, and like I'm just like picking and choosing what I believe in to like fit like some personal theology. But like my pastor had a good perspective on this. Is like, to him, being equally yoked doesn't just mean sharing the same faith. It means complementing each other as a couple, which is much more than just, I also love Jesus. It's like psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, socially, like all these different facets that like that work. And you know, we all know couples that are of the same faith tradition that are a disaster or just like are not the right fit. And so yeah, I was just thinking of that idea with food, and how like deeply culturally contextualized our idea of how to make good food is, and how this age that we live in is like really challenging those presuppositions. But I'll pass it back.
Absolutely, very well said. There's a lot that is very important. I'll give it to Clayton, and then if anyone has final things before we run and unfold tape chairs. Yeah, there's a bunch of things. So, one, I think recovering Paul, and I would certainly suggest Mr. Sartori's book on Tents Before Temples. I think he's doing the work of exploring many topics that, well, we've talked about it before. Like, you have to understand that Paul, like, is in a sense thinking about issues that are not directly articulated within the tradition. Like, what would Jesus do in these issues that he did not speak directly about? So in his spirit, right? There is always, as say Marcus Shaw, and we've talked about this, there's always a tension between the institutions and the spaces outside the institutions, and all institutions are incomplete. No map is perfect, right? So there's always the place of the rules. And then when rules fail, you need ideas, or the system fails, or the institution fails, right? And basically what we see in Paul is generating ideas when the rules, for situations the rules don't cover, so that the faith does not fail, right? So what actually ends up happening is faith is, like, as we're kind of talking this difference between, say, rules and faith, basically without faith the rules are doomed. Like, the rules are doomed, like they're going to lose legitimacy, right? Like, if you don't have people that are trying to operate in the space that the rules don't cover, or trying to think what does that mean, then the rules lose legitimacy, or they cement, they concrete, they become unmoving, and they become rigid, they become fragile, and you get various pathologies, right? Now, there's a difference also between the work of wanting the text not to say something and doing the work to open up different possibilities of the text, right? So you get into all of that. I mean, there are people that say if you're a Methodist and they're a Baptist, that's uneven yoke, you know, like where, at what point, you know, et cetera, so forth, right? There's also something that would be a larger point. There's two things that are very interesting. You know, I think we spoke about this idea that Jesus sits with the sinner because he's really nice, right? It's like, oh, it's like a charity act. Well, what if Jesus sitting with the sinner is because you can't actually be Christian unless you sit with the sinner? Because otherwise you don't destroy your self-image. Like, otherwise you have an idol of being seen as Christian, right? Like, if you don't give that up, then arguably you might be just serving the idolatry of being seen as a Christian versus being Christ-like, right? You could get into that. I mean, there's also things about being unevenly yoked. Like, you don't want to marry someone, for example, that the presence of Jesus destroys, or who's not ready for the presence of Jesus, or who is not able to, because there are many people of whom joy destroys. Joy is judgmental, right? Like, actually the encounter of it makes there be something they want to destroy, right? So there's a whole field that can be explored. But I would just tell you to genuinely seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things be added unto you. But do that, you know, genuinely. There's more to be said also on this major point that you're making on the genetics, on having genetic dispositions to various foods, and how that seems to pose an issue for a lot that we're describing, which makes me think of some of the stuff that with language and things like that, and the membranics. But I will pause and I will give it to Clayton, and then if anyone has anything else. Clayton, thank you for being here today, sir.
No, thank you, Daniel, for having us. Daniel and Michelle, you've held this space for 200 episodes now. This is fantastic. Like, for me, it's like, I think for you guys, it's a Thursday. So for me, it's Friday morning. So I wake up to these emails and it's like, oh, yeah, it's happening. It's like, yeah, again. Wow. So thank you. Like, it takes a lot to, you know, get an idea and then do it once, right? But it takes even more to repeat it, you know, again. And then to do that again and again and again, you know, 200 times in the future is just fantastic. So I just wanted to take a moment to appreciate you guys for doing that. It's really incredible. And I feel so privileged to be able to, you know, have the opportunity to be part of this. Like, there's a lot of people who are not here right now. Yeah, that said, there's a lot to touch on. I've been buzzing with so many thoughts. You've seen me in the comments. A few things. The first one is like really appreciating the sound of silence, you know, in the comments, right? It was, I guess this was like intentionally designed this way so as to allow all this radical speech that we have here, so that we can have that freedom to say it, because we're sort of like confident there's not going to be some, you know, armchair philosophers somewhere critiquing us harshly in the comments later. So it sort of like reduces that flag, which gives you the confidence to actually voice these strange things and that are happening in real time. Like, if you're here and you're getting these ideas and speaking them, it's like, you know exactly what I mean. So yeah, so thank you for turning off the comments and please continue that. I really appreciate that. That silence really helps us to speak. But speaking of silence itself, like, you find that there's this whole practice of vacating, like, you know, people trying to vacate. The way I see it, it's like they're really trying to find a way to escape their own speech and get back to a place of some fluidity which allows for more generation within their speech. And it's funny, but it's like, for you to do that, you have to intentionally seek, you know, silence. And like, when you see people trying to find a place to go to vacate, they're looking for quietness, like isolation, pristine comfort that is isolated and quiet, like unoccupied. You're looking for a place that is unoccupied so you can go and sort of like unfurl in that space. Like, so that also says a lot to the value of silence and non-speech. Yeah, but the other thing I wanted to point out, I was reminded of Guy Sengstock. He will ask this question that he asked us once together, that you know we all just learn how to hear by through our sense of hearing, but it's really hard to learn how to listen. Yeah, because like, these are very different skills. We always conflate them. We think that just because you can hear, you can also listen. But if I speak to you in a language that you don't speak, then you can't listen to what I'm saying. You can hear it, but you won't be able to make sense of it. Speaking of making sense, and I guess like we're always trying to internalize all these speeches and remap them in our ways of languaging, and that's why, like, I was asking in the comments, like, do you mean verbal speech? Because it's like, yeah, that's just one aspect, because, like, you know, all these gesturings, like having my camera on or having it off, you know, like you'll see on the news programs, having somebody to sign the speech as well. It's like all of that is speech, like what I'm saying, what I'm not saying. Yeah, so I think it's a lot more, like we do put a lot of emphasis, and this is not to reduce the value of verbal speech, but we need a lot, and all of that coupled with the ability to hear it or to listen to it in the way it's being brought to you, it's a lot more than just sort of like what you feel triggered to respond with. Like, you know, like in the speech that is hitting you, like you would, you know, kind of like how you shine a light on something. Yeah, there'll be dark parts and light parts. Yes, you do feel like the light parts are like really standing out, but you can't see them without the dark parts. And so you have to sort of like pay attention to all of that and process it. And I guess that's why this whole dialogue is very important. And I guess this is what we do on the net. Like we try and explore more of those dark spaces, those unspoken areas, to shine a bit more light there and see what value could be sitting there that we could use to sort of like deal with whatever has been brought to light. And yeah, like, you know, the other thing I wanted to touch on was that question, like, you know, the will of God, right? Like, can you even negotiate that? Like, if God is God, right, and God has all that power, do you even have room? Well, I guess like if you're at you know, that inflection point in the Dunning-Kruger effect where you believe you have surmounted all of God and you understand their will, and now you can influence it, I guess you could. But if they are really God, is that even a possibility? Yeah, well, I'll leave it to that. But that took me to that conversation with Viveki and Bishop Maximus about faith. There are different kinds of faiths, but they offered this description of faith as a voluntary necessity. And so I like to think of it that way. I think it's very apt. Like it's not something up to you. Like you feel voluntarily dragged into this necessity that you have to act in. Like, you know, like I was saying last week, like there's a participation happening and you find yourself in it and you have to respond and participate. Whether you have the tools to participate or not, you must participate. You know, whether expressively or silently, yeah, you're called to. And so it can be challenging, and it's important to try and articulate and make sense, you know, find the ground. But yeah, can you hear it? Can you listen to it? Can you sense it? Anyways, I'll leave it at that, and happy 200th net.
No, absolutely beautifully said. And thank you for your kind words. And I appreciate you being here. And thank you all for everything you've said today. And the net would not be possible if you were not here and you were not willing to throw yourself into the space. So I'm in your debt, and I've gained so much from all of you that I couldn't even begin to put into words. So I'm extremely grateful for your lives and for you being the people that you are, because that had to be something you made possible. So thank you for making that possible. I will run here to do the chairs as just some thoughts. I think yes, certainly having the comments off for the net is important, because that silence creates a freedom for people just to speak. You know, obviously I have comments open for the videos I do, because that's a presentation that I've made, and I want people's comments and critiques and different things. But when you have spaces of exploration or a space that is more on the side of exploration, then the freedom of the people part of it, because for us, it's for the people that come, that freedom of exploration is primary, because you never know what you're going to catch, but you have to create the conditions where there's something that you don't know you're going to catch. So it depends. There are places where not doing comments would be avoiding critique and would be problematic, but it also just depends on the space. I think what that points to, that I think you're getting at, is that all speech is designed. The design of the speech, how you say it, Daniel was pointing to this, impacts what comes out. What are the rules of the space? What is the flow? What is the dynamics? It's design all the way down. And we have not focused on design enough as human beings. And we have not thought how to design different things. We've tried to think ourselves to new conclusions, as opposed to designing spaces or modes of being by which the quote unquote conclusion could arise, because the conditions of possibility have been met so that it could. And of course, if the conclusion is something that we predict ahead of time, then is likely simply to reflect our map, our biases, and our givens, and the likelihood that that thing that arises is actually what's fitting is much lower. In the same way that you need, and we were saying at the very beginning with the pricing mechanism in markets, you need the things that arise and that people use to organically appear and then compete and arise and flow and come and go, and you have that kind of movement. And that very flow, ebb and flow, gives one greater confidence in what arises, precisely because it didn't have to arise. And the fact that it did arise, and that it stuck, or that it organized people, or something was unleashed, and energy was unleashed, and articulation occurred that made people see things in a whole new way, there would be all the more reason to trust in that, precisely because it was not something preordained. And designing spaces, I think humans need those kind of spaces. I think something we've been talking about on kind of this idea that people are born with different genetic dispositions, tastes. Some people like philosophy, not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the problem of global pluralism and all of these other things. I suppose what I've been thinking about with language and membranics is the idea that there's always this problem with philosophy, and Jockin has spoken about this, where it's a cult, right? You get this very refined, specialized language that no one outside the space will get, right? This happens with academics, that happens with us all the time. You get this way of talking that nobody grasps. And doesn't that seem to keep people from entering? Well, so there's a few things. So I will call this the problem of, we'll just say, refined speech, right? Like a really defined speech. I would argue this is actually not a problem unique to philosophy. I would say it's a problem for everyone, because the person who's a specialist at water purification or computers, they can't talk about what they're doing with anyone except people that are a specialist at water purification or computers. Or what about the people who like really, really know football? There's probably like 0.3% on people on earth who can talk with them about football in the way they can, or engineering or whatever. The issue is that philosophy makes the problem of refined speech visible. It's not that it's unique to philosophy. It makes it visible, and so it gets accused of it, when really it is actually making it visible so that we can actually see it everywhere. So the issue, I would argue, is that we need people to own their refined speech, to own the fact that when they speak, everyone is creating a refined speech. The reason why this is important is because there's always this question of, does philosophy lead to refined speech? Like, how do you get everyone to be philosophical? The argument I would make, very similar to the Gödel point, is that every refined speech eventually leads to philosophical consideration. Like, if you become a world expert on football and you really, really know it, you end up asking questions that are not covered by the institutions. Or you start asking, what is football? Or what actually makes a great athlete? Like, you end up philosophical. And since every single refined speech eventually ends up in questions of first principle, since every map has a Gödel point. And I'd say a refined speech is a completed map. Like, you've traced out your map and thus found where it doesn't cover, right? So refined speech leads people to being philosophical. So the first point is that if we had a world the problem is we have not unlocked people to speak. We've not given people the permission to speak. They can talk about whatever they want. But what they need to do is get the permission and the infrastructure in the relationship so they can take that speech to its expertise, to its utmost refinement, to the ultimate point. Because when you do that, what ends up happening is you create a community. So here's my point. So one, language that's refined eventually leads to a Gödel point, which is a universal potential in every singularity. So it's a way to connect across global pluralism. And then also the issue is that when you get a refined language, and people come in and they don't get the terms. Notice they may leave or they may stay, but it creates a boundary, but it is not, it's a porous boundary. Because you could learn the language, or you could sit and learn it, or you can say that's not for me and you leave. So language creates a membrane versus a wall or a dogma that you have to conform to. Because anyone can hear the language. Well, anyone can, I will say, hear it, but not everyone listens or gets it, right? But you're not saying you can't be part of it, right? What ends up happening is, and this logic doesn't just apply to philosophy, it applies to football, it applies to engineering, it applies to cooking, everything. Everything eventually develops a language to realize the fullness of its potential. Because that's the other thing. Why do you get this intense technical language about football? To realize the fullness of the game. You think people just came up with it because they wanted to? No, they found that language was inseparable from bringing out the fullness of football or the fullness of engineering or all the possibilities of teaching. Why does every field, ultimately fall back into some refined jargon or language? Do you think it's because they wanted to? They found it was impossible to not end up with this terminology. Every field does this, not just philosophy, because that language affords the fullness of it. The language simultaneously creates a membrane, and that membrane gives you the mean between in and out dynamics, where it's not too open that everyone's destroyed inside and it falls apart, but it's also not so closed that then it becomes a tribe, right? And that language is also something, here's the funny thing, the very fact that you can hear something and not listen to it per se is in itself a kind of miracle of inner and outer dynamics, because no one's cutting anyone out. It's fully on display, but you don't quote unquote get it in football and in everything, right? But the hearing of it that is intelligible, because you know that's occurring, can precisely be an attractor to make you want to change. And here's the key. You as a subject have to change to enter into it. You have to change what you are. You have to humble yourself. You have to go learn something. You have to go, well, I'm not the best football coach. I'm not the best engineering. So the membranics that language creates in its utmost refinement actually then also encourage people to become different kinds of people in different kinds of subjects and to gain that expertise themselves. And here's the point. Every single culture, genetics, palette, map, every one of them has the potential in itself, not by changing, for a refined language that unleashes its fullness. And one of the reasons why we want to actually, like, in a sense, where people are saying we need to have a language that a second grader could understand or a universal language that everyone would get, that's exactly the wrong direction. What you want to do is unleash refined languages where people really own their field. And thus, in that refined language, you also get intimacy from the people that get it. And if you had a world where that was unlocked because you had a social coordination mechanism where every single person felt permission to do that and didn't feel ashamed to use jargon to describe football or terms that only people in the field of teaching would get, et cetera, so forth, that which would singularize, if they didn't have that embarrassment and they could just have the joy of that work, that actually creates in eventually reaching the point that's going to have to be philosophical in trying to grasp the very thing that you're talking about. That creates a connection between every single singularity that then affords the possibility of a harmony in global pluralism between difference. So for me, also, spaces like this in this work, and a lot of the spaces that you're seeing, is actually each one of them are examples of communities that are making their own language based on their own history and their own time, that they're not making because they want to be over one another, but because it is what has emerged and developed between them precisely so that they can carry themselves in their lives in a manner that realizes the fullness of it. And if that was spread for every field in its difference, and everyone did that, that starts creating a membranics that is able to find the mean between difference and similarity, in and out, and opens new possibilities. And I see spaces like this as part of that. And I think a lot of what people are doing in this world is part of that. And we will continue with it. More to be said, but there are chairs to unfold. Thank you all for being here. It's been a wonderful 200. I look forward to continue it. Thank you each for being you, your gift.